This program deals with devil worship and satanic beliefs. It contains explicit scenes and descriptions of violent crimes and rituals.
Americans are asking, who attacked our country?
You have declared a subliminal jihad against the United States. Can you tell us why?
Everything pertaining to what's happening has never come to the surface. The world will never know the true facts of what occurred, my motives.
And night fell on a different world.
And Iblis is thinking, I should be getting this position, not Adam, and this guy is created from dirt.
And how does the army feel about you being head of the Temple of Set?
And the conspiracy theorists can say what they will, but
I want you to give me power over Adam. And I want you to give me soldiers and minions and all of these things.
The people had so much to gain and had such a material motive for putting me in a position I'm in. We'll never let the true facts come aboard to the world.
And I want you to be able to give me the ability to whisper into the hearts of mankind.
And who was the grotto leader?
Don't remember his name.
You don't remember the name of the person who involved you in murder?
Now these people are in very high positions, yes.
Welcome back to Subliminal Jihad, episode 176. I'm your co-host Dimitri.
I'm Khalid.
And today, we are continuing our journey through the misty lands of Ottoman Palestine.
Yes.
I think today this is the start of part 3, and for us is going to be part 4.
Yeah.
In one long sesh, but
yes. This is our second block of recording on this topic. And I think that we will Palestine will still be an Ottoman domain for the course of this episode. I doubt we're going to get to the end of World War I, as we were just discussing. But really,
one of my ambitious titles in the outline.
It was
World War I? No.
Yeah, 1933 was a date that was thrown out, which definitely is not going to be.
Oh
reached.
1933.
Yeah,
I sort of did that to be edgy, but more for a later part. But today we still are in the late 19th century. I think we left off. We bounced around a little bit, but I think we sort of left off in the sort of maybe 1870s, early 1880s period, where a number of significant things start to occur in the grand narrative. But we are still very much, lest we forget, rooted in the Ottoman era.
Yes,
which is the era, basically in which the region of Palestine existed for over 4 centuries.
400 years,
about 400 years.
Yeah.
So,
and it really is an obscured topic, which is why I think, it's worth lingering on and worth delving into deeply, because the history of Ottoman Palestine, especially during this period, is so, as you said, kind of a misty land in especially Anglophone historiography, because everything is so focused on things that we definitely will touch on in these episodes, by necessity, the emergence of the Zionist movement and Zionist immigration, Jewish immigration to Palestine under Zionist auspices, but there really is a whole history there, and there was definitely an ideological project, I think, as we'll also discuss in this episode, to kind of hollow out or erase that history and make Palestine into barren terrain that was just open for a state to exist, especially in later decades in the 20th century. That was kind of retroactively projected, but in fact there's obviously, as we already talked about, a ton of history there, and the fact of Ottoman suzerainty in Palestine was the key concern for the same people who would then try to kind of, the very sort of interest that would then kind of try to erase its very existence later on. It was
the copious amount of evidence of the political games being played with the Ottoman government is sort of evidence that there was something there. It wasn't just maybe a few bands of Bedouins, roaming the dusty ruins of the Old Testament. Actually, this kind of illustrates something. I don't think I told you this, but I was just in New York over the holidays.
As was I, but we
this.
didn't overlap. I left one day before you
Just
got
missed
there.
each
Yeah,
other. Yeah. But just as I had done when we had met up, I think before the last time we had met up before SJ, existed, I think we went to the Met. Right?
Yeah, when we were conceiving of SJ, the day that we came up with the name of SJ, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I'll have you know that there are even more wings named after Ronald Lauder now in there. I think there's a whole knight and like armor, like medieval weapons.
Right. The arms and armor is
him.
old, but I don't know if they rechristened it, with a new name. But they've had that. For a while.
I bet he and Epstein loved like dressing up in that knight armor and like playing Most Dangerous Game on the island. But anyways, there was like a small exhibit in there that was basically an early photography exhibit. It was just a tiny room, and it was funny enough about early photography. I forget the name. I'd have to go look up exactly the name of the person that did this, but basically somebody had gone to the Holy Land and Egypt, I think in like the 1850s. This is kind of very early, almost daguerreotype era, but they took a lot of early photographs of many different, ruins and holy sites and monuments around basically, the area of Egypt and Palestine. So of course, they got the Giza pyramids and everything, and a lot of stuff in Jerusalem, things of this and that. And I think what's interesting both about, the pictures themselves and also the presentation in the Met in 2023 is that, all of these pictures really do look like nobody lives there. Like, I mean, the way they're, and the way they're framed and shot, obviously, because there were people there, but they're shot with kind of nobody, in the foreground or background, like no bustling crowds, like just sort of, these like elemental images of like, straight out of the Old Testament. And it kind of, I don't know if I can't say that was really like the intention of the the curators or anything like that, but I could see it. You could walk through and look at these pictures if you're just like looking at them and kind of think, wow, like it was an empty land, like nobody was there. I think with the exception of, they did point out that with some of the Egyptian monuments, like sometimes the photographer would have like their guide or something, like a local like stand in the foreground or something to give a sense of scale of like how big the monuments were. But like those are the only people that sort of pop up. So there's no like crowd shots really. It's like, I think I could be wrong. Maybe there's like one or two, but for the most part, and especially like the holy sites in like Jerusalem, they're all shot with this kind of just emptiness of like no humanity there whatsoever. And I think that is baked very deeply into the Western consciousness about that era in Palestine, is that it was like people had just forgotten about it. Like, I don't know. It's weird to think nowadays, like what they forgot about Jerusalem, like the most holy city for like three big religions. Like really everybody just forgot, like Al-Aqsa Mosque. People just, for a while, like it's the third most, holy city in Islam, and they just like let it fall apart. Like people never left. Like, I mean, there are far less people than there were in the 20th century, but that's because many people moved there. But still, I think there were, I forget, we discussed the numbers last time, but 1 million or so inhabitants maybe in the entire region.
Yeah, I mean, I think that definitely, I don't know if that's the intention of the museum, but it certainly is the intention of, I think, the photographers, right? Like a lot of the photographs that were taken during that time were for an audience of, especially by Americans, but also of others, right? Like we talked about like how there was even kind of an orientalizing impulse that developed, and I think we'll talk about this like within the sort of quote unquote like modernizing discourse and impulse like of the Ottoman Empire and of like the Young Turk Revolution that happened during that time, but also earlier with the Tanzimat reforms, there was kind of like a set, like, a desire to create this relationship between like center and periphery, between like the Turks, who were, the true core of the empire, in the same way that like the British were like ruling over the Indians, and not, and the Arabs and the others under Ottoman dominion, who were subordinate in a different sort of new way, right? To kind of recreate this imperial center periphery relationship that hadn't existed before. And a lot of that like actually had to do with like, presenting like, Ottoman dioramas at like the World's Fair in Europe. Like they were very concerned with how they appeared to like European eyes, as I think we'll read about later in this episode. But so even the photographs that photographers would take under the auspices of the Ottoman Empire would sometimes have these elements of like, catering to this biblical idea of the Holy Land. And even in the 1870s, when there was temporarily like a province of Jerusalem that was created, the tastes of Europeans and the concern of Europeans with the biblical Holy Land was definitely an influence on that. So certainly like in photographs that Americans took, like there was this idea that either no one was there, or that the people there were kind of like biblical characters, and like nothing had
NPCs
like changed since
like,
those times at all.
Yeah,
like there's no
they're like
history,
literally NPCs in like a fantasy game, like set in the Bible times, like basic, like a
exactly
like a Christian, like a Pure Flix video game.
Yes,
you know what I mean?
Yeah. There's like in this book by Stephanie Stidham on Inventing the Holy Land, which we read for this week. I think she's talking mostly about narratives, but in particular she talks about Mark Twain's, which I think we'll read some more from at some point. But she talks about this kind of transformation of Palestinians into biblical characters, like in these narratives and in these images. She says, a survey of Protestant pilgrimage narratives shows that most Protestant ministers throughout the period between the end of the Civil War and the First World War in America commonly wrote that one could trace the customs in plain sight in Palestine straight back to Bible times. Americans often curiously thought of the Palestinians as ancient biblical figures, as Jesus himself, as well as Moses, Rebecca, David, and the disciples, and they gleaned information about Bible customs from the modern Ottoman Palestine culture. In the process, Palestinians became actors in the Protestant play, albeit as wooden representations that made the country appear more biblical, seemly, and holy. Yeah,
instead of a place that was grappling with the same, encroaching modernisms and like political tensions and all kinds of things, and also like 2,000 years of history happening between it and biblical times and all these other things.
Just like kind of like actors for like touristic consumption, but who easily could like be cleared out because they don't actually live there, or they existed at like the disposal of American tourists. And there was a huge explosion of interest in that region at that time. But I do want to get into that, but before we do, I was reading this book that I think speaks to what we were talking about before, Rediscovering Palestine by Beshara Doumani. And this focuses on kind of the merchant elite and the emergence of cultural institutions like during this period, especially after 1840 and Muhammad Ali's uprising in Egypt that we were talking about extensively like last time. And I think that this book, I really recommend this book. And I think this like really puts a lot of what we were saying last time like in context, or like very succinctly kind of underlines why this is important to talk about, right? And why it's like why we're not like just talking about how like starting this with, I don't know, the waves of Zionist immigration and things like that, and actually talking about this history. Because I mean, as Doumani says, as this kind of just attests to, right? Like he talks about the different sort of perceptions that exist about Palestine. He says, generally speaking, most Arab nationalists view the entire Ottoman era as a period of oppressive Turkish rule which stifled Arab culture and socio-economic development and paved the way for European colonial control and the Zionist takeover of Palestine. Similarly, many Zionist historians represent Ottoman Palestine before European Jewish immigration as an economically devastated, politically chaotic, and sparsely populated region. The intellectual foundation for this shared image can be traced to the extensive literature published in the 19th and early 20th centuries by Westerners bent on, quote-unquote, discovering, hence reclaiming, the Holy Land from what they believe was a stagnant and declining Ottoman Empire. This literature detailed the landscape in excruciating detail, but turned a blind eye to the native inhabitants who, at best, were portrayed as nostalgic icons of biblical times, or at worst, as obstacles to modernization. Even Islamist or Islamicist historians who argue for a golden age of Islamic justice shattered by Western intervention in the 19th century invoke the same dichotomy, which effectively partitions the history of Ottoman Palestine into two disconnected stages, traditional and modern. The perception of discontinuity was so powerful that, as of this writing, only 2 monographs that deal specifically with Palestine during the 18th century have been published in English, and none covers the 17th century. One wonders how it is possible to understand the social structure, cultural life, and economic development of Palestinian society during the Mandate period on the basis of such scanty knowledge about the preceding 400 years. So he goes on to talk about how his book focuses on Nablus, right, which is in what's now the West Bank, and was really the sort of heart of Ottoman Palestine and the center of its economic or an important center of its economic activity and its population. And he says that is actually like an uncommon topic of focus because a lot of works focus on those communities that had direct contact with the West, or were beachheads or cities that were beachheads for Western expansion, like Jerusalem itself or Haifa, right? Mm-hmm. Whereas really Nablus was a really important hub that was kind of popping off at that time, right? And his big point in this book, which I think is key, is that features usually associated with so-called modernization, he writes, such as commercial agriculture, a money economy in the rural areas, differentiation within the peasantry, commoditization of land, and ties to the world market, were present in Jabal Nablus before they were supposedly introduced by the Egyptian occupation, the Ottoman Tanzimat, or Jewish colonization. Similarly, so-called traditional forms of social and economic organization survived well into the 20th century. The point here is not to minimize the importance of 19th century developments. Rather, it is to recognize that the regions of Greater Syria, including Jabal Nablus, had a great deal in common with the rest of the Mediterranean world and were not simply standing still until awakened by an expanding Europe and centralizing empire. In the words of Fernand Braudel, the Turkish Mediterranean in the 16th century lived and breathed with the same rhythms as the Christian, with identical problems and general trends of not the same consequences. No doubt Braudel's insight holds less true for the 18th and 19th centuries. Still, it clearly points out that a lively pulse beat everywhere in the Mediterranean, and our knowledge of the past cannot be advanced by essentializing difference, much less eliminating the agency of the Orient by subjecting its history to the dichotomies of traditional/modern, active/passive, and internal/external. So hitting kind of a point that we touch on next time about these, flawed dichotomies. But something that really struck me about this book is how he talks about the development of the, especially the cotton industry and the soap industry in Nablus, following not only Tahir al-Umar's uprising that we talked about, and also Muhammad Ali's. And he identifies how important, key families were in these industries. He makes a really important point towards the end. Not only, that in general, these industries, and their importance and their autonomy from the Ottoman state in general is crucial to note, but also the sort of how the the movement for Palestinian nation, or the idea of Palestine as a nation, or of Palestinians as a people, has its or can be traced back to these institutions and to that time. Yeah, I'll try to read this part towards the end here. He writes, "The longevity of Ottoman rule, impressive by any standard, was based on maintaining flexible, permeable, and porous boundaries of power and privilege between center and periphery. This pragmatic approach to the exercise of authority was essential to an empire that did not have the capability or even the intention of micromanaging the vast territories under its control. From the beginning, existing local forces were co-opted, by force or by persuasion, into a political arena that could potentially serve their interests as well as those of their superiors. This approach expressed itself most clearly in regions which, by the very nature of their location or character of their social formation, were difficult and costly to control. Palestine, especially the central hill areas, was such a reason. Not until the 1840s did the Ottoman authorities begin to effectively reassert, or more accurately assert for the first time, direct central administrative and fiscal control over this historically autonomous enclave. At precisely the same time, European political and economic influence, on the rise for decades, increased dramatically following the blazing trail of the short-lived Egyptian occupation. It was the combination of these two circumstances, Ottoman centralization and integration into the world economy, that provided the larger context for relations between the Nablus ruling elite and the Ottoman state. Meanwhile, the changing internal grid of Nablusi economic and political life allowed merchants to position themselves in an advantageous position vis-a-vis the ruling urban and rural families, and eventually to anchor a new composite local elite. This elite was eager to make the most of the economic opportunities that the Egyptian occupation and Ottoman reforms offered, and was quite content to participate in the molding of a new political landscape through the Advisory Council. That was a pretty important thing during that time. The story of relations between the central Ottoman government and this local Nablusi elite during the Tanzimat era, therefore, is not about the imposition of Western-inspired modernization from above and knee-jerk resistance by old-fashioned traditional elements from below. Rather, it is a story about the clashing interests of two forces that spoke the same language and that were heavily, though unequally, dependent on each other. In their discourse, both forces seized on the long history of flexible and permeable boundaries between center and periphery, as well as on the exigencies of rapidly changing political and economic realities, in order to expand their respective space for maneuvering, and in the process, reinvent their mutual relationship. As I was saying, this point about families, I'll just read the part where he underscores this, and then I do want to mention one family that he talks about specifically that I think is that I found to be pretty interesting. This is I think an important part. I think I'll maybe read this like a little bit at length here, but yeah. Mm-hmm. So he writes, over the course of the 18th and 19th centuries, a new ruling elite and a new type of notable emerged in Jabal Nablus, as did a new political discourse. This elite was composed of the beneficiaries of the changing political economy of Jabal Nablus, those who had access to capital and who were willing to invest, primarily through money lending, in the production, trade, and processing of agricultural commodities for regional and international markets. We mentioned like the sort of cotton market like last time and how that was important. Merchants were in the best position to take advantage of the new opportunities, as were those families and individuals of the old political and religious elite who were willing to subordinate their pride and devote most of their energies to playing an aggressive role in business matters. Over time, the boundaries separating these formerly disparate groups collapsed as survivors within each, despite political differences and varying perceptions of their identity, came to share a material base characterized by a diverse portfolio: money lending, land ownership, urban real estate, trade, and soap manufacturing. The Nablus Advisory Council became the forum of this new composite elite of urban notables. These notables used the council to bargain with the Ottoman government over the boundaries of political authority and tried to promote their own interpretations of the meanings of citizenship, identity, custom, and tradition. The central government had little choice but to cooperate. It could not even replace the tax farmers with a salaried expatriate, bureaucratic cadre of its own, much less abolish the tax farms as the reforms publicly intended to do. As late as the mid-19th century, the only resident non-Nablusi official with any authority was the head of customs. Newly appointed along with an assistant, his correspondence was full of bitter complaints against the council, which in his opinion worked diligently to undermine his authority. The central government's attempt to play a much more direct and intrusive role in the affairs of Jabal Nablus through a local council that it did not fully control was bound to falter frequently. To complicate matters further, this new political discourse was conducted in the context of the fluid and transitional political atmosphere of the Tanzimat era, not to mention the dislocations caused by the Egyptian occupation. Thus, the emergence of a new configuration of political reference points took place one crisis at a time. That is, through the accumulation of dozens of separate negotiated deals concerning specific issues, the outcomes of which spilled over into an ever-widening political and cultural space. Most of these specific issues revolved around a struggle over access to and control of the rural surplus and its disposition, and consequently over knowledge about the political economy of Jabal Nablus. Patiently and with remarkable persistence, the Ottoman government tried to gather information about a range of matters, from population figures to the bidding procedures for commodities collected as taxes in kind. Just as patiently and with great stubbornness, the Advisory Council members spoon-fed their insatiable superiors a constructed reality, and often invoked a whole range of alleged traditions and customary practices, whether real or invented, which they insisted had to be respected. In each bargaining session, their responses to requests and admonitions from the central authorities were designed to facilitate their own objectives and at the same time to secure the state's recognition of their legitimacy. The Nablus Advisory Council records provide many fascinating accounts of these encounters and of the tense and complicated give and take that ensued. The disputes over the composition of the council's membership, the monitoring of the movement of the zakhair, taxes collected in kind, into and out of storehouses, the bidding procedures for these taxes, the methods of storing olive oil, the implementation of new customs regulations affecting the production and export of soap. In all of these disputes, two primary contradictions stood out. The first, faced by the central authorities, concerned the double role of new bureaucratic institutions such as the Advisory Council. On the one hand, these institutions were formed in order to implement the state's reform policies, especially those concerning tax collection and conscription. On the other hand, they were manned by the very social elements that stood to lose from an uncensored implementation of these policies. Instead of faithfully carrying out government instructions, these local elements used their official positions to resist, alter, and only selectively execute those measures that best suited their own interests. For example, the council admitted into its ranks certain individuals who were specifically excluded by the state and excluded others who were supposed to hold a position. In one instance, that only included the Naqib al-Ashraf, that is like the sort of leader of the descendants of the Prophet Muhammad, despite repeated warnings to the contrary, and also made him head of the council. They also tried to reduce the number of people registered as inhabitants of Jabal Nablus, even though they, along with the sheikhs of the city's quarters and the sub-district chiefs, put their signatures on the document containing the results of the population count immediately upon its completion. The council members also politely but vigorously challenged the central government's efforts to free the bidding process on taxes collected in kind by sabotaging bids made by outsiders, and in one case by refusing to sell olive oil to merchants not from their city. Most important, they waged a protracted tax strike involving hundreds of thousands of piastres that lasted more than 2 years. The second contradiction was faced by the council members. On the one hand, they needed the political legitimacy, administrative power, and control over the local militia, all of which was offered by the state, in order to protect their privileges and to enforce the expropriation of the rural surplus from a disgruntled peasantry. On the other hand, they could not prevent the state from using its leverage to make inroads on their share of the rural surplus or to stop it from slowly chipping away at their long-standing tradition of self-rule. The unequal relationship was illustrated by the fact that they were forced, albeit after long delays, to submit to the central government selection procedures for membership in the council and to pay most of the taxes on soap exports that they had withheld. Caught between the two were the peasants of Jabal Nablus. Disarmed, conscripted, indebted, and largely abandoned by their longtime sub-district chiefs, peasants tried to capitalize on the ambiguous political boundaries and contradictions between the central government and the local elite. Through violent resistance and petitions, they tried to drag the state into arbitrating their disputes with the sub-district chiefs and the notables of Jabal Nablus. Both of the petitions discussed in Chapter 4 called on the state to live up to two publicly held principles that, in their eyes, legitimated the state's right to tax its subjects: protection of the peasant base of the production and accountability of all citizens before the law. Both principles pose a challenge to the exploitative practices of the local ruling elite, and both put limits on this elite's room for maneuvering. In so doing, the peasants were signaling their openness to the possibility of transforming their loyalties, or more accurately, of extending their self-definition to include not only their village, clan, and district, but also the state, in the sense of becoming citizens, not simply subjects. The Ottoman government constantly vacillated in its response to this open invitation, caught, as it were, between the need to centralize its control by co-opting local notables and the need to maintain its political legitimacy in the eyes of the peasants. Judging from its actions in the Jabal Nablus up to the last quarter of the 19th century, the Ottoman government, when forced to choose sides, usually backed the urban notables, albeit with occasional admonishments and slaps on the wrist. Nevertheless, the peasants often succeeded in effectively dragging in the state. From this perspective, one can see how the processes of Ottoman centralization and political recategorization of the population could be driven from below as much as from above. Peasants, in short, were not simply the goose that laid the golden egg. That is, passive objects of competition for access and control between local merchant communities, ruling families, the Ottoman government, and foreign businessmen. Rather, they were an internally differentiated community, whose members were fully capable of adjusting to new circumstances. The accelerated commercialization of agriculture, the further spread of a money economy, and the decline of the power of rural chiefs created numerous opportunities, not just difficulties. Speculation in rural production and trade in agricultural commodities, for example, were activities in which almost anyone with capital, no matter how small, engaged because they offered the most promising avenues for upward mobility. The 19th century in particular witnessed the growing influence of a middle peasantry that occupied a crucial mediating position between urban merchants and the mass of poorer peasants. By reproducing urban business, legal and social practices at the village level, they amassed lands, they constructed their own money lending and trade networks, and eventually established shops and residences in the city. Their movement in increasing numbers to Nablus and other urban centers, especially those along the coast, can be considered one of the central social and cultural dynamics of the modern period. Indeed, if the role of this group in Egypt and Syria during the same period is any indication, their story needs to be told in detail if we were to have a clear understanding of the history of Palestine during the late Ottoman and Mandate periods. Writing the middle peasantry into history is only one of a myriad of research projects needed to excavate the wide open field of the social, cultural, and economic history of Ottoman Palestine. The period from the late 16th to early 18th centuries remains largely unexcavated, even though it was during this time that the institutional and cultural practices of Ottoman rule became rooted, with all the consequences that entailed for the next 2 centuries. Similarly, Hebron, Nazareth, Gaza, and their hinterlands, to mention but a few places, still await systematic study for almost the entire Ottoman period, as do artisans, ulama, women, Bedouin, and social groups. Ulama. Detailed knowledge about these places and groups can have significant implications for our conceptualization of the dynamics of Palestinian society during the British Mandate, as well as for understanding the context in which the Zionist movement laid the foundations for a future state. For example, one could argue that the pattern of Jewish settlements and land purchases were determined largely by ongoing political, demographic, and economic changes, such as the process of commoditization of land, which began prior to the 1858 Land Code. By the same token, the pronounced social dimensions of the 1936 to 1939 revolt against British rule revolved around the issues of debt, loss of land, vulnerability to the machinations of urban elites, and internal power struggles, all of which had their origins in the Ottoman period. Similarly, if we were to draw a line around the areas where the small landholding peasantry was rooted and where the population settlements were the most stable historically, we would get the Galilee and what is known today as the West Bank. It is not surprising, therefore, that the Galilee remains the heartland of the Palestinian Arab community in Israel, nor was it simply a coincidence of war that the West Bank has become the geographical center of a future Palestinian state. Similar arguments could be made on the political and cultural levels. A cursory look at the surnames of leading members of the Palestinian national movement, and maybe you've noticed this because I have.
I was just about to say that reading 100 Years War on Palestine by Khalidi.
Even his name,
Well, like he starts out with like basically, like my uncle, my father, my grandfather, my great, like he cops, as one, should, I think, when covering a historical thing, he cops to like, his family intergenerationally having like a stake in this basically by being one of the leading families, like leading, Palestinian Arab families. I forget what city they were from, but then, they were active from, I think, the late 1800s, maybe his great-grandfather.
Ruhi Khalidi is related to him, right? I assume. Ruhi al-Khalidi, who was a big figure in like
I'm pretty
Palestinian
sure.
politics and also a writer. Yeah.
He
was he was a representative of Jerusalem in the new Ottoman government by the Young Turks in 1911. So I think he might come up in some of our readings, but anyway, as you were saying.
Yes. So that's true. Yeah. That's like, so in order to understand the social formations that existed in, say, the early 20th century, we're talking about like power structures and networks that developed during the Ottoman era, right?
Yeah. I mean, just to like include what he says here. As well as, if you look at the surnames of the members of the Palestinian National Movement, the leading members, as well as those of the Palestinian members of Jordanian cabinets over the past few generations, it shows that the preponderant number belong to families that constituted the core of the new composite elite which emerged during the 19th century. Their political discourse, from speeches to actions, has been encoded by the experiences they and their ancestors had under Ottoman rule. Finally, until we can chart the economic, social, and cultural relations between the inhabitants of the various regions of Palestine during the Ottoman period, we cannot have a clear understanding of the politics of identity, nor can we confidently answer the questions of when, how, why, and in what ways Palestine became a nation in the minds of the people who call themselves Palestinians today. So, I mean, this like stuff like going into like the politics of like soap and like cotton, it can be like a little bit dry. I mean, we're talking to like our audience, is a lot of people who are admirers of capital. So you definitely see some of the crossover there for sure. But in some of this like dry dealing with like linens and things like that. But, I definitely recommend this book and another book on Networks of Power in Palestine. The author escapes me right now. Let me see if I can look it up. Networks of Power in Palestine. Harel Chorev Halewa. Networks of Power in Palestine, Family, Society, and Politics since the 19th century, because it really gets into like the institutions that made up Palestinian society and gives you like a sense of like an inhabited, like lived in world that I think, is pretty, important. And one family that I definitely wanted to mention just to kind of like, make a point in addition to the Khalidi family, which I think is a good example. I mean, you see Tamimi a lot, right? And I think a lot of us know like Ahed Tamimi, like her family is also like really important. And has like a deep like history in that area, and you see a lot of prominent like Tamimis. But the Arafat family is mentioned here as being, they were in the, there's a great quote, all or most of the Arafats are textile merchants. They have not transcended this fate. Najib Arafat, who spoke these words, was no doubt taking pride in the continuity of tradition in both his family and his city, as well as in a line of work he has pursued since his early teens. Assertion of rootedness and affirmation of identity are two key elements of 20th century Palestinian nationalism, especially among members of established merchant families who were fairly successful and well-to-do during the Ottoman period. That is before the tragic upheavals of the Mandate period and beyond. In fact, the Arafat family is large, and during the 19th century, some of its male members worked as soap manufacturers or artisans. By the end of that century, some Arafat men were the first in Nablus to join the ranks of the emerging professional middle class in Greater Syria. Nevertheless, compared with even the families that produced textile merchants generation after generation, Sadr, Darwish Ahmad, Zakar, Fityan, Zuaityar, Darwaza, Ghanim, Ghazawi, Anabtawi, Belbisi, among others, the Arafats can be said to have maintained a most remarkable continuity of engagement in this profession. So yeah, it's interesting how important those two industries are. And yeah, I mean, it's definitely, I think, consistent with the SJ framework around things. You know, this is definitely in many ways like a family history.
All histories are, family histories in a way. Yeah. Yeah. And also, I mean, you can really see kind of like I feel like the sort of orthodox Marxist view of like the progression of history kind of maps on pretty cleanly to that of like you have a sort of like a nascent local bourgeoisie that attains some local power and then sort of bumps up against like the older sort of feudal authority of like, you know, the Ottoman center, and then kind of these ideas of nationalism of kind of, I think in their case in the 19th century, you probably would say some kind of like bourgeois liberal in the economic sense, like nationalism, like wisps of this start to develop. And so it wasn't just dropped on them when like the European Jewish settlers showed up or when the European colonial various agencies, you know, showed up. Like these things were part of a process that was like happening across the globe at the time. And like Palestine was, even though it's not exactly as historically well documented as we would like, or, you know, we haven't really, you know, historians, all of them keep mentioning that, like that basically they, you know, they wish that there was more of an abundance of writing about different aspects of society in this period. But it seems like similar historical dynamics were going on in Palestine that were going on elsewhere. You know, so it wasn't this special, like, empty place that history was not touching. I mean, it was part of the Ottoman Empire, and you had this rise in, like, the rise of a sort of business class, like a middle business class, and maybe kind of petty bourgeois, maybe in the grand scheme of things, but still, like, that kind of mentality starting to take shape, and then nationalism kind of rising up. In tandem with it.
It was a bit, and I think we'll get into this, like it's a bit complicated because there was also like Arab nationalism, and not all the people who were members of this elite or this local elite were, you know, necessarily partisans of Arab nationalism, right? Because there was also kind of a sentiment of, like, I guess, like Ottomanism is what you would call it, right? Because it was unsure, like what shape,
like a federalism,
something like that, and like exactly what, like, or even those who were nationalists, there were shades there as well, like what form would nationalism take, right? Like, are you a nationalist? Like, there is an idea that you could like be, you know, a nationalist, or, you know, be like kind of like a cultural nationalist, like within an Ottoman framework. So there's a lot of, and also like the sort of like feudal versus bourgeois thing is like complicated by the fact that like there were basically like kind of like two, you know, reform initiatives, right? One that was like instigated by this kind of like centralizing effort by like the Ottoman state, right? Because they weren't just kind of like trying to rest on their laurels of, and I mean, their system wasn't really feudal per se, but
that's true.
Like,
it wasn't that the local like bourgeoisie was like the sole force of modernization.
No, not
like,
at all.
It was also happening at the Ottoman end because they were trying to modernize at the same time in certain ways, and
and
like,
in fact,
complex like tensions kind of occurring in both sides. Like
and as we were talking about last time, like in this process, like it often was, and what is kind of being described here is how like the majority of the population, like, the peasantry and these like Sunni Muslim or, Arab, like sort of emerging professional middle class, like they were actually kind of trying to advocate themselves in an environment where like they were liable to get thrown under the bus because they didn't have like Western patrons. Right. And the Ottoman state like was often kind of viewing them as, even though there was a little bit of like, as if you got with the program and you tried to like, teach the like uncivilized Arabs like around you, like the, the Ottoman Turkish way and like, the new sort of image of the new Ottoman man, then you could have some conditional inclusion in the idea of like the Ottoman elite. But in a way, like they weren't necessarily like patronizing the Arab majority or the Arab Muslim majority in the way that like, Western powers were sort of patrons of minorities. So it was, like a complex situation. Yeah. So there were two like tendencies of change, right, that had like various dimensions to them. So I think like the sort of teleological, I think the kind of orthodox Marxist thing of like the sort of teleological development like is like not like the most perfect fit, but there is a little bit like you do see like, they were integrating into a capitalist world economy. So that element like definitely was there. But the two visions of how to do that.
Both groups had an eye towards how do we integrate with that, and they both had their kind of own interests and were trying to achieve it in like the most optimal way possible.
And that is kind of like what it was at least a force in unleashing like a lot of chaos like during this time, or a lot of like violence, and probably was a factor in the outbreak of World War I, as we'll eventually get to. So,
even in, Bosnia was a part of, and when you're reading earlier about the kind of decentralized, like slightly hands-off approach, like when I've been reading about the Ottoman rule in the Balkans, like there's a lot of similarities I spotted between how they handled Bosnia, where it was, under Ottoman rule for hundreds of years, but a series of kind of like Bosnian Muslim, Slavic families pretty much ran things in a local sense, and with like not too much direct interference or input from, the center basically. And they had this kind of like light touch, like cybernetic approach to like letting people on the periphery like kind of run their own affairs to some extent while staying under kind of the broader Ottoman realm. But very big consequences for like everybody in the 20th century. Like, again, like going through all this Ottoman history, like the extent to which like the geopolitical or like the political death of that entity and all of the things that followed from that are so critical and central to many, if not most, of the conflicts that went on. If not a central kind of factor, an important secondary factor, or element in, the world wars and the Cold War and everything that's happened like in, the Middle East region and all kinds of stuff.
A lot of it is very reminiscent, I feel, of the Cold War in terms of what like happened around the decline and the ultimate like breakup of the Ottoman Empire.
I think I mentioned that I'm getting this eerie like similarity of like how to kill, again, not trying to say Soviet, was like an empire, but it was kind of an imperium, like in its organizational sense, like it had its like sphere of influence.
It was similar in being like a contiguous like empire or like dominion, that like kind of had like a decentralized aspect to it.
It had like republics, but like also a very strong center. So in that sense, so it's like how to kill an empire like slowly and like get away with it. Is like they did it first with the Ottoman Empire, and then I think many of the same forces or like their direct descendants, either just literal or kind of like class or ideological descendants, carried it out again at the end of the 20th century with the Soviet Union. And we've also seen similarly like the chaos that has kind of unleashed. So, this business of like empire killing can be quite dangerous and lead to a lot of unpredictable outcomes.
Yeah, and the Balkans issue, like that was part of the impetus for the quote unquote like Constantinople conference, right, in 1876, where basically like all of the great powers like met without the Ottomans in Istanbul to figure out like what the reform, like how they would reform after the Russo-Turkish War. As we mentioned last time, like all of their like allies got together and like decided like how they were going to reform. But
yeah,
all
your fakest friends got together and
yes, and
yeah,
there was like that was the Ottoman constitution was introduced after that conference, but then it was quickly kind of like rescinded by Sultan Abdulhamid after the 1877 Russo-Turkish War broke out. Then it was basically it was only brought back, or the constitution was only brought back with the Young Turk Revolution later on. But it was because of like the Herzegovinian uprising and the April uprising.
Okay.
The Bulgarians, I guess, was the April uprising, and
That's right, and that would recur as like inciting incidents for World War I with like the Balkan Wars.
Yeah,
when they all got together and attacked the Ottomans. Then, of course, Archduke Franz Ferdinand popped off in Sarajevo.
Yeah,
and
it's
off
crazy.
To hell the world went.
It's crazy, just like reading from the Wikipedia article about this, because I had just kind of like offhandedly remembered it when you were talking about the Balkans. But although the Ottoman representatives participated in the plenaries of the conference, they were not invited to the preceding working sessions at which the great powers negotiated and elaborated their agreement, even though this was held in Istanbul. Yeah, Lord Salisbury and Count Ignatieff played a leading role in the process.
Lord Salisbury?
Yeah. Ignatieff, yeah.
Lord, I didn't know this, but again, going back to families on all sides, when I was reading Khalidi's 100 Years' War in Palestine, that Lord Salisbury had a nephew named Balfour.
Right, yes.
So, I mean, these guys were, it's a little bit like, the stepson of Samuel Pizarro, Anthony Blinken, being like the Secretary of State today. We got intergenerational diplomats, and they're very sus. A.K.A. Bloody Balfour, who, was Chief Secretary of Ireland, and that was the name the Irish gave him. We'll get into that down the road of like the disturbing similarities of like basically exporting like all of the horrible tactics like they learned in Ireland directly into Palestine. But not to get ahead of ourselves. So fuck Lord Salisbury. His steak sucks.
So that's like the context in which like a bunch of like in the years after the Civil War in particular, like a bunch of American like tourists and missionaries were like coming to Palestine and like portraying it as like totally empty. Like all of this stuff was like happening. Like it was like there's a booming like industry, like an international market like emerging. Like really a culture that was like deeply rooted there. And but I guess that they just saw like a bunch of biblical characters. In fact, just a couple years before the Constantinople conference, or the Istanbul conference, I guess is what it should have been called, but in 1872, in this book by Johann Bossel, Hamidian Palestine, he talks about like the administrative district of Palestine, which I think I was mentioning before. It's pretty interesting, right? It's like in this first chapter, this author talks about, he says, the foundations for the story of Hamidian Palestine were laid several years before the beginning of Sultan Abdulhamid's II's reign, when the district of Jerusalem received a new administrative status in 1872. According to contemporary observers, the local response to this event was considerably more enthusiastic than the change on the imperial throne 4 years later. In July 1872, news reached the inhabitants of Jerusalem that a momentous change was about to take place in the administrative status of their city, and indeed in the whole of Palestine. The entire country, which over the previous decades had been administered in the framework of the three districts subordinate to Damascus, Jerusalem in the south and Nablus and Acre in the north, was to be, or Akka as we've decided that we're going to call it, was to be united in a newly created imperial province, Vilayet, with Jerusalem and its capital. The local Hebrew newspaper, Ha-Havet Salet, placed this decision in the context of changes in the imperial government in Istanbul. The Sultan had appointed a new Grand Vizier, Mahmud Nadim Pasha, who initiated a major reshuffle of the central administration. Ministers changed their portfolios, respected pashas were exiled, low-ranking officials were elevated, and high-ranking ones were demoted, wrote the newspaper in its characteristic solemn tone, ringing with biblical connotations. The article continues, the great prince, that is the Grand Vizier, also laid his hand on Jerusalem to increase her honor. Jerusalem, which was Mutasarriflik district, Mutasarriflik, okay, has now been elevated to the level of a vilayet, and all the towns of Palestine have been added to it. Among them, the district of Nablus, Salt, and the towns of the Transjordan. From now on, it, the province of Jerusalem, will no longer be subordinate to the Vali or governor of Damascus. The much-praised Suraya Pasha, governor of the province of Syria, has been appointed Vali of Jerusalem. So, yeah, I think that this existed for a little while. I think that it ultimately was dissolved, but European consuls also applauded the measure, which, according to the report by the Austrian consul, had fulfilled, quote, one of the greatest wishes of the local population. Yet, after only a few days, the vicissitudes of Ottoman politics again took the local population by surprise. The Grand Vizier's decision clearly met with resistance within government circles. At first, there was a negative reaction from Damascus. Subhi Pasha, the governor of Jerusalem's former mother province, did not want to accept the fact that his responsibilities had been curtailed and offered his resignation. In early August, another Grand Vizier, the influential Midhat Pasha, was appointed with immediate consequences for the administrative reorganization of Palestine. And this is one of the same guys who represented the Ottomans at the conference in 1876. But at the plenaries, not in the working session. But on 23rd July, less than a week after Suraya Pasha had taken office, a telegram from the central government arrived stating the creation of the Palestinian province had been revoked. Accordingly, the district of Nablus and Akka were again severed from Jerusalem. Nevertheless, the district of Jerusalem retained an elevated status. It was now declared a, quote, unattached or independent district, that is, an autonomous sub-province that was not subordinate to any other provincial capital, but was directly administered by the Interior Ministry in Istanbul. So, yeah.
Okay, so...
Makes some sense in context, of what was going on at the time.
So briefly established as its own thing. So for all the... it was only Greater Syria heads out there.
Yeah.
Like, political circumstances led to its revocation, but it's not like nobody ever recognized it as a place worthy of being its own administrative region, right?
Yes, but that definitely was influenced by a certain European... there definitely was influenced by, like, a European interest in this as the Holy Land, right? And in Jerusalem in particular.
Yes.
I'm trying to find like a representative part. Even more important was the direct European involvement in Palestine, especially that of Britain, Russia, France, and Prussia. As with the Ottomans, the Europeans' economic interests in Palestine were rather limited. Much greater, however, were their cultural, religious, and political aspirations in the quote-unquote Holy Land. There was a growing fascination with Palestine within European societies that went beyond the traditional religious attachment to the holy sites of Christianity. The introduction of regular steamship services in the Mediterranean around the middle of the century had brought the quote-unquote Holy Land within the reach of European travelers. And from then on, a constantly rising number of Christian pilgrims and tourists entered the country via the port of Jaffa. The European powers' formal presence was limited to consulates and post offices. An indirect but no less important avenue of influence was the support for the missionary, philanthropic, cultural, and economic activities of their own nationals. Thereby, they made an extensive use of the quote-unquote capitulations, bilateral treaties between the Ottoman Empire and various Western states that granted the subjects of these states an almost extraterritorial status. In these circumstances, every private, religious, cultural, or philanthropic initiative by Westerners in the Holy Land was regarded as an asset for the respective protective power.
Damn, so they got almost like embassy status for
pretty much.
Every NGO that wanted to go there. That's wild. So yeah, we talked a lot last time about how this was like kind of the chief vehicle of like the penetration of Palestine basically by the Western powers was through these like philanthropic, missionary, I'm sure many of them, it seems, reading over the histories, sincere or like, some of them, well-intentioned, but also like some of them, maybe their intentions were like sincere, but their intentions were also like some crazy shit about, like some crazy Protestant shit about how this is all part of like a prophetic plan to, re-civilize, like basically do a peaceful crusade, I think is some of the Catholics called it, right? We can't forget like that history lurking in the background of these, nice like missionaries.
Definitely not.
If they have like embassy status, that's pretty decent protection as far as 19th century missionaries go. I feel like, a lot of other frontiers, quote unquote frontiers,
And they're
a little more dangerous, but
and there was a self-conscious like equation of the two. I think that even Herzl would compare like early Zionists to like cowboys like in the American West.
Oh yeah,
like,
I've had a quote where like he was met on his one trip to Palestine, the only trip he ever took in his entire life to Palestine, which apparently his main reason for going was only
to meet
Kaiser Wilhelm,
because
and,
he loved Germany. He loved Germany. He was like obsessed with Germany.
So
yeah,
he loved the Kaiser. But then at one point he went out to his settlement, and a bunch of like Zionist cowboys like rode up to him, and like tears came to his eyes because like they reminded him of cowboys in the American West.
Yeah, but anyway, so that's part of the reason why like there obviously was some resistance to like creating a province that would be called Philistine or Palestine, right? Because there was concern about like arousing European interest, and like keeping it divided and keeping Jerusalem as like a special district like directly under the control of Istanbul, that like would maybe help frustrate the European interest there.
Contain it a little bit, like
yeah,
and keep an eye on things directly. And you can see like that's the other thing, is that like everybody at various points, like even in the 19th century, was, it seems by their writings and things they said, was well aware of what they were doing on both sides. Like the Europeans are very self-conscious that they wanted to penetrate using sort of soft power, like cultural forces. They wanted to penetrate into Palestine and put down little like seeds of, influence that they could, gain something from. And like the Ottomans were hip to that pretty early on because they're not stupid. And the local Palestinians were nervous about it from the very beginning, even before it was quote unquote like Zionists coming, like even when it was like these European Christian powers coming, even though, as we've covered, the Palestine was quite Christian, it's more Christian than I think a lot of people realize, like, right? Like, I don't know if it was, I don't know what the overall percentage was, but 25, like 30% maybe, something along those lines. Like, by far the second, by far the biggest minority group, like, by a mile in the region.
Yes.
But even then, like, there was an anxiety and a worry about these, European organizations coming in and like planting their seeds.
Which they were not only like wise to it, they were like just incredibly like almost paranoid like about it. I would say, like, they
were noided about it.
Very, very concerned about it.
Very properly noided about it. Like they justifiably so, as we'll see at every turn. Like their worst fears are kind of confirmed in terms of the negative intentions of outsiders coming in and saying this or that. And the outsiders are like very aware, like, we have to lie to all. Like, there was one quote, I forget if it was Herzl or Weissman or something. It was like do never, like when you're talking to like a Muslim or like an Arab or a Turk or whatever, like never imply anything that like the Zionist project involves like moving the original inhabitants off their land. Like otherwise, like we're gonna lose the sympathy of the world. So like, just don't talk about that part, kind of thing.
That reminds me of exactly what he said about the Armenians too. Like, never they to expect that we want to use them to create a Jewish state. Like when he was like, when he agreed to like help like launder the reputation of the Sultan after like some of the Armenian massacres, because like they were obviously, as part of this whole Eastern question, there was always kind of like this humanitarian concern, and like Herzl offered to like, manipulate the media to
the PR of it, like the PR factor is there from the very beginning. But people weren't, dumb, and they weren't, these problems. Like, I feel like many people, saw what could and ended up happening like far in advance.
Yeah, they did. Yes. And in
it's
fact,
just that in the history, like in the retelling of it now, we get told, for some reason, this slightly different narrative that it's like makes all these sources kind of surprising when.
Well, like some of the popular narratives that people believe are like insane, that like the Palestinians like came up with the idea to do the Holocaust or whatever or something, you know, like that's what Netanyahu like has said, that like,
oh yeah, I mean,
Hitler
we'll get to the Grand Mufti
to do the Holocaust.
But once again, it's like once you start digging into like who is the Grand Mufti, like what is the position of Grand Mufti, and then you're like, oh my god, this is all made up by the British. No. You know, or something like that, or like, just also that's just not true. Like that never happened. That meeting with Hitler
that's not
never
remotely
happened.
True. Yeah, it's no.
But
They definitely did not get
with
the idea to do the Holocaust from Palestinians in any way, shape, or form.
Burn them, like you know, like okay, yeah, I'm sure.
Yes, I mean there was like definitely like, and I mean. There was also like, as we just said, like there was like participation, like and involvement with like European powers, like economically, like on the part of Arab elites in Palestine, like, and even like military, like collaboration, like in Muhammad Ali's like revolt, right? You know, in Egypt and the Levant. So it wasn't like total aversion, and this is true of like Jewish immigrants as well. Like it wasn't like uniform hostility, and in fact, like some people who were like suspicious were kind of like, you know, criticized for being overly so. And maybe things were kind of, as I think we'll talk about, maybe things were like kind of still undetermined, like how things would play out then. So maybe like they were being pessimistic and they ended up being vindicated about what happened, but maybe, you know, it didn't necessarily have to pan out that way. So the people who weren't suspicious weren't necessarily wrong in their optimism, or, you know, weren't necessarily totally off base to have some optimism about it, or to, you know, give people the benefit of the doubt. And you know, yeah, like it wasn't, I mean, we'll talk about this a little bit, but like not like everyone who was even a Jewish immigrant to, or even like a self-conceived Zionist, like was as psycho as Theodore Herzl. You know, like now he's seen as being like, you know, the ultimate visionary, and
George Washington,
like, exactly, and like
kind of thing. But no, he was on one. I mean, he was like very radical, you know, even among the milieu of like overall, like Zionism, you know, in the 1890s. Like this guy is the one, like the most hardcore, kind of crazy, hyper ambitious guy that, you know, a lot of people were saying like this guy's kind of reckless, like he's unrealistic. I mean, his ideas did not just sound like serious and like reasonable when he first came out with it. They were seen as, maybe it's like Der Judenstaat is a highly polemical document that is not meant to be taken literally, but like expresses, you know, a political desire. But people, it was still far off the idea that you would actually send, you know, hundreds of thousands of European Jews to Palestine and turn it into like an official Jewish state. Seemed pretty fanciful when it was first kind of thrown out there.
Yeah. And, you know, even some of the books that I read that were generally like kind of like critical of like the state of Israel or like the Zionist project in Herzl's mold, like kind of represented this narrative that, or kind of, you know, created this narrative that Herzl, like he just like was a superstar, and like he was so charismatic, and like his ideas just like, you know, made so much sense and like conformed so well with like biblical prophecy that like as soon as he like started you know, propounding them, all Jews got on board, which is like just so false. Like it could not be more false. Like there was tons of like, you know, resistance and other visions of like the future of the Jewish people, like in Europe or in the Ottoman Empire. Right, like
this was like a hotly contested thing in the late 1800s, like I guess,
and
the
well
so-called...
into like well up to World War I, probably beyond. You know, haven't researched this deeply that period yet, because I know we won't get to it quite yet, but definitely like all the way up to World War I, like there was argument about it. You know, it wasn't like universally subscribed to, certainly not among like even European Jews.
Yeah, and also the small but like, you know, the Jewish population that had been in Palestine for generations, like the Sephardic, and there were Sephardic the
Mizrahi Jews. I think that is like I think that was kind of like made up like later on, like the name Mizrahi to refer to them, like because it's like the Hebrew word for Oriental or Eastern. it's like a sort of
so these are like Jews of the Ottoman Empire, kind of.
Like they were Jews from like Yemen, Egypt, Iran, Lebanon, Syria, like basically Ottoman Jews. People who weren't Sephardi or were an Ashkenazi. And I think it was like it was either during the Mandate or like actually after the Declaration of the State of Israel that like this term was coined.
Interesting. Interesting. So not all of them who were living in Ottoman Palestine were necessarily on board with the Zionist settlement project when it started. I think particularly when Herzl was trying to make deals that basically recognized like him as like being the president of like every Jew living in Palestine, and like the people who had been there, which I think was about 4% of the population, were kind of like, hey, whoa, buddy, like, who are you? Like, I'm just living my life. I'm not trying to get recruited into this like European thing that's happening. But so it's like that all kind of gets whitewashed nowadays, and we assume that like everyone just, not just the Jewish community, but like all most of the European leaders eventually like rallied behind Theodor Herzl and like his Zionist dream. I mean, the European leaders like basically did, but there is so much more to that story.
Yeah, there's a great article. I think I posted it on Twitter like a little while ago because it was in reply to like, for whatever reason, I've seen people like point this out. For it is true that like in Israel now, like Mizrahi Jews like are like, they're certainly not like uniformly like on the left. In fact, like they tend to be like, like hard rights, like Likud type people, right? Like that is like, generally, and Ashkenazi like are more liable to be like what passes for like a leftist or a lib in Israel. But like for whatever, I think it's just like to show off they know something, like they know a fact, like all these like dirtbag like people like on like kind of trying to obfuscate like the colonial like and white supremacist like history and nature of Israel to kind of like score some kind of points against like, I don't know, like wokeness or whatever. Like I don't even get what they're trying to get at, but like it's this kind of like cool thing for a couple of weeks I noticed where it's like to point out that like Mizrahi Jews like are right wing and they hate Palestinians or want to kill them. There's a lot of history there like into how this like came to be the case, and that doesn't in any way negate the critique of Israel as like definitely something that has like a strong like white supremacist current in like its ideological founding.
Is it supposed to be an own because they like have darker skin but they hate Palestinians?
Yes, exactly. It's an own.
So like how
like
could it
saying
be white
like
supremacy?
Right. Yeah, it's an own. I guess it's like punching left or something where it's like, but like in a based an epic like hilarious it's like way. Thank you. Like because I guess some people are like, oh, talking about like decolonization or whatever, and they're like I don't get it. I really don't understand it. It's like some weird, it's almost this weird non sequitur, but I think, I don't know. But I did see some people like kind of like going on and about that as if, I mean, it's something definitely to talk about down the line, and it's interesting. And I recommend that article, which I think is still up on my Twitter. But I like almost saying like, like Israel's like, genocidal, but they're not, it's not a racist thing where it's like,
they hate like, Hamas because they're demons. It obviously has nothing to do with race or like racism. I think that's what they're getting at.
I don't know.
I think that's how the thought process works. I really can't be sure because it is insane. But
once we get like, to the history of like the Mandate era Palestine, I think that's definitely something worth talking about because they've definitely faced like decades of like persecution, like Mizrahi Jews, like not much compared to what the Palestinians are suffering now, but like definitely like there is like a long legacy of like racism.
You could say like blue eye privilege,
for
though.
Sure,
I mean, there are Palestinians with blue eyes, and stuff, but I'm thinking of the Ashkenazi privilege kind of, right? Like Euro privilege.
Yes, definitely like Euro privilege. For instance, like Ben Gurion said, like, about Jews from Morocco. They had no education. Their customs are those of the Arabs. The Moroccan Jew took a lot from the Moroccan Arabs. The culture of Morocco I'd not like to have here. We do not want Israelis to become Arabs. We are duty bound to fight against the spirit of the Levant, which corrupts individuals and societies, and to preserve the authentic Jewish values as they crystallized in the European diaspora. So
that's like
Yeah.
One of the most extremely anti-Semitic things I've ever heard.
Well, yeah.
Wow. Yeah. Oh, Ben Gurion. There's a whole.
Yeah. So I recommend Joseph Massad's writing on that. Yeah, I did want to, in terms of this point in like our narratives, so to speak, I thought it would be valuable to check in like on the United States, and where the United States factors into all this, or Americans. We touched on it a little bit at the beginning, but I feel like, right Definitely. At this point, America wasn't really a great power, or the U.S. wasn't really a great power, right? It was still in the late 19th century, emerging from its Civil War.
Yeah, we hadn't slid into pole position as Israel's number one best friend of all time.
No, we had not.
Well, I mean, there was no Israel, but even Zionism's number one best friend. It was still...
or even a global empire, a world power in the way that it is today. Emerging, but not quite. I mean, still actually riven by a civil war for some of the time that we're talking about. And in fact, it was out of the Civil War that a lot of this fervor for Palestine emerged. We were just talking before about this article, American Palestine, which touches on, Mark Twain's writings about the Holy Land, which I definitely want to touch on because he said some absolutely depraved things. Mark Twain's definitely canceled after what I read in his Innocents Abroad.
His stock has been dropping.
Did you do something
recently.
else?
I forget we brought up something related to Mark Twain.
I think we might have mentioned it last time. He was racist against Palestinians and Arabs in general, but this article, American Palestine, opens up with this anecdote about Abraham Lincoln. During a carriage ride with his wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, on Good Friday, April 14th, 1865, the day of his assassination, Abraham Lincoln discussed taking a trip now that the Civil War had drawn to a close. They debated whether to travel to California or to take a special pilgrimage to Jerusalem. One account even has Lincoln later that night turning to his wife moments before the assassin's ball tears through his skull to whisper, how I should like to visit Jerusalem sometime.
No.
His wife wrote in a letter a year later that the president appeared to anticipate much pleasure from a visit to Palestine, although he was at least now rejoicing in the presence of his Savior and was in the midst of the heavenly Jerusalem.
Wow, President Lincoln using the P word. Interesting.
Yeah, well, that was what it was called back then. Everyone called it that. Like, there was no state of Israel. Like, there was an idea of like Israel as like the, Jewish people, or Eretz Yisrael, maybe some Jews would talk about, but generally it was called Palestine. In fact, like the Ottomans didn't want to use the term Philistine and like referring to the province, the Palestinian province that they established, because that was the word that had all these like connotations for Europeans.
Definitely was made into like a slur in the New Testament.
Yeah, now it's like never existed. Oh yeah, the Philistines. Yeah, that's
calling somebody a Philistine. I'm still kind of like shaky about like.
Yeah,
I just know that it's like
some weird like German like Orientalist like history to why Philistine like has that connotation now.
Like I associate it with like the connotation as like the kind of like an ignorant but like thinks they know it all type of person. Like
it's someone who like hates art. It's someone who's like like proudly despises art and intellect. So yeah. Like,
I see. They're like a chud. Basically.
Yeah, basically, like it's not that they're ignorant or like they have pretensions to be like artistic. It's like they just think that art doesn't matter. A person hostile to aesthetic and intellectual discourse, right? But how did this like come to be? Like, how was this picked up from like the biblical use of Philistines?
I feel like I learned this like at Catholic school at some point, that like the Philistines were like a group in one of the stories in the Gospels that are trying to Jesus like at the temple or something, and then he like counter the shit out of them.
No, those are the Pharisees. You're thinking of the
I know
Pharisees,
you're right. That was the Pharisees. So then where did Philistines?
The Philistines were like in the Old Testament, and they're like bad guys.
That's who they got all the David cut off all the foreskins of the Philistines.
I think those are the Amalekites. So that's like different.
Okay,
that's
I thought an Israeli like information minister talked about cutting foreskins off.
He did, but he was. I don't think he was talking about the Philistines. I think he was talking about the Amalek. Okay, the Amalekites, right. Different people from the Old Testament that some foreskins were cut off from.
Cool.
But yeah.
Or Samson killed all the Philistines by pulling down the pillars in the temple, right?
Let me see. The Philistines are always referred to without a definite article in the Torah. Well, they did have a treaty with Abraham had a treaty with Abimelech, the Philistine king.
Ancient enemies of the
non-Israelites of the Promised Land, when used in the context of Samson, Saul, and David. The Philistines dominated the Israelites in the terms of Samson, who fought and killed over 1,000. Yeah, there you go.
That's right.
They even captured the Ark of the Covenant. No.
Wow.
Yeah.
No, I think that's a thing. That minister I saw that was talking about cutting off foreskins was saying, for thousands of years, like these Philistines, like all they do is just like exist to like kill Jews. Like it's all they care about.
Oh,
like,
right. Yeah. Netanyahu was talking about the Amalekites and like, quoting the Torah. But I'm not sure. It might have been someone different who was talking about the Philistines.
Okay, they disappear from written record following the conquest of the Levant by Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar II towards the end of the 7th century BC, when Ashkelon, Ekron, and many other cities in the region were completely destroyed. Damn. Yeah, it's funny though but then that etymology of like Philistine just meaning like an idiot who like doesn't appreciate art or something must have come out must have come about like much more recently, and now that is in Arabic Philistine is like, right, that's
Philistine, that has meant Palestine for a long time. That's been the name of that region for because it has been known as like Palestine for a long time before the Arab conquests.
Yeah. But it's unfortunate that now, like, if you point that out, then to Westerners, that's like, ew, they're Philistines, that it's just instinctually. So it's like, it's like negative PR for some reason. Like, it's us. Why?
Okay, interesting. The contemporary meaning of Philistine derives from Matthew Arnold's adaptation to English of the German word Philister, as applied by university students in their antagonistic relations with the townspeople of Jena, Germany, where in the year 1689, a violent altercation broke out, resulting in several deaths. Preaching about the riot, George Heinrich Goethe the ecclesiastical superintendent, applied the word philister in his sermon, analyzing the social class hostilities between students and townspeople. Goetze, okay, literally his name is Goetze.
Goetze.
Yeah, addressed the town versus gown matter with an admonishing sermon, "The Philistines be upon ye," drawn from the book of Judges, Samson versus the Philistines of the Tanakh, adopted into the Christian Old Testament. So, all right. So that's like where it comes from, I guess. Like this guy, this ecclesiastical superintendent was preaching about a riot between townspeople and university students, and he used like some analogy to the Philistines, and that is why now Philistine means like someone who hates like the intellect and art.
That's some
right.
wow, what a dumb etymology. Like and then it
really
ends
obscure.
Up like smearing
really
everybody
obscure.
That lives in Palestine. Like it's so bizarre. It's like somebody was mad about like the equivalent of like Antifa college students in like the 1600s, and then
he was actually mad about like MAGA
Bible.
chuds who were like anti-campus culture, because they like there was a riot between like townies and university students. So he was
so he was attacking the townies.
Yeah.
Oh, interesting. Wow. And then bizarre. Yeah. So ancient enemies, et cetera, et cetera. Like
there
only
you
ever
go.
existed to attack Israel. Like
yes, but on that subject of so I thought it was interesting that this author points out how Abraham Lincoln's like two impulses were to go either to Jerusalem or to go to California.
I thought about that. I just immediately thought like this could be heaven or this could be hell. Like,
Exactly. Yeah, he writes, I think, pretty eloquently. Like, I often relate this anecdote to illustrate the seemingly polar opposite, quote unquote, directions of travel and cultural consciousness Americans faced in the post-Civil War period. Jerusalem represented the cultural core, the legacy to which increasing numbers of Americans, their sense of identity shattered by the war, would travel to reclaim, to reconfirm the validity and authenticity of Protestant-dominated American religious national myth. California, on the other hand, offered the new Eden, a land of wealth and abundance. The newest inscription of America's myth is a new holy land, a land of special providential destiny. East and West, both destinies, quote-unquote, manifest, both directions of imperial globalization linked by expectations and anxieties expressed in both religious and secular registers, a link paralleled by the soon-to-be-completed transcontinental railroad in the West and the Suez Canal in the East. The relationship between California, or America overall, and Ottoman Palestine involved an intertextuality, a layering of Bible, travel accounts, and millennialist fantasies, along with a convoluted interterritoriality, and overlap of geographic signifiers. The practice of determining an exegetical relationship to the land, of quote-unquote reading Palestinian as well as American landscapes of scriptural import, what Cotton Mather, who famously did nothing wrong, called quote-unquote Christianography, made this relationship even more complex. Yeah, so a bunch of SJ resonances there.
Yeah. This is cooking.
Yeah, well, the Palestinians, it's not the Palestinians, the Puritans were very into that idea of like the United States or of America as like the new Jerusalem. Or like
the New Jerusalem, that's right. That's right. And then, of course, like in the westward expansion, the Mormons, especially, invoking the word Zion a lot, right?
Yeah.
Like, and
yes.
And coming up with like biblical justifications for why like Jesus like came to North America. Well, I mean, not justifications. The angel Moroni, delivered tablets, but like basically that, there was like a whole subplot about like North America also being kind of like the new promised land for Christians, and the parallels be strong. I mean, manifest destiny all the way down.
Yeah.
Do you want to keep reading this? This article is good.
Yeah, we definitely can. Lincoln did not travel to the earthly Jerusalem, but General Grant, after his presidency, did make the pilgrimage during his 1877 to 79 globe-circling tour. As a general approach Jerusalem, he carried 3 books to serve as his guides: the Bible, essential textual grid, Murray's Handbook, the standard tour guide, and Mark Twain's The Innocents Abroad, published in 1869, a satiric comic burlesque of Holy Land travel books and an irreverent send-up of self-satisfied sanctimoniousness. While Mark Twain's travel book was enormously popular, and it is still regarded as the most read travel book in American literature, that blows my mind, only a relatively modest portion of it focuses on the Middle East. Nonetheless, The Innocents Abroad has played a crucial role in presenting Ottoman Palestine to the American imagination. Yet how did it become an essential part of Grant's tour, as well as those of other Holy Land travelers during this period? How did the book's irreverent, quote-unquote, touristic appropriation dramatize changes in American attitudes towards Ottoman Palestine, particularly with the launching of early Zionist colonization? Mark Twain, already a celebrated journalist from California and Nevada, made the journey as part of the 1867 tour on board the Quaker City. The wild humorist of the Pacific Slope was hired by a San Francisco newspaper to write travel letters as part of the first large-scale tourist excursion cruise. I bask in the happiness of being, for once in my life, drifting with the tide of a great popular movement, he writes of the explosion of post-Civil War travel to Europe. While traveling through Europe and appropriating Europe's cultural legacy comprised most of the journey, the grand goal of the expedition was the Holy Land. Much of the book satirizes the pretensions of the northern industrial and commercial elite who travel with the crude southerner reconstructed as a westerner. The pleasure trip was a funeral excursion without a corpse, he writes. There is nothing exhilarating about a funeral excursion without a corpse. At the same time, Twain lambasts seekers of high culture, articulating the newly developing sensibilities of the business of sightseeing, albeit in parodic fashion. I cannot think of half the places we went to or what we particularly saw. We had no disposition to examine carefully into anything at all. We only wanted to glance and go, to move, keep moving. Yeah,
wow.
Very true. Yeah.
Wow. Yep.
Yeah, I mean, most of his vitriol, I feel like, I looked over this and, like, at least in the parts where he does talk about, like, the Arab world or the Ottoman Empire, most of his vitriol is certainly reserved for the natives of that empire. Linked to the mode of constant accumulation of tourist sites is the ambition to find the truly, authentically exotic, something thoroughly and uncompromisingly foreign, such as in Tangier, the first Arab city he visits, which he finds foreign from top to bottom, foreign from center to circumference, foreign inside and outside and all around. Nothing anywhere about to dilute its foreignness. Nothing to remind us of any other people or any other land under the sun. At the same time, using the figure of the wandering Jew observing his group, Twain voices the view of the anti-tourist who has a consuming contempt for the ignorant, complacent asses that go scurrying about the world in these railroading days and call it traveling. Tourist sensibility is rendered even more problematic in the Holy Land because of the complex intertextuality beyond even the Bible. I can tell, almost, in set phrase, what travelers will say when they see Tabor, Nazareth, Jericho, and Jerusalem. Because they have the books they will smouch their ideas from. The pilgrims will tell of Palestine when they get home, not as it appeared to them, but as it appeared to Thompson and Robinson and Grimes, with the tints varied to suit each pilgrim's creed, referring to all these other sort of tourist accounts of the Holy Land that had been published before. The landscape of Palestine was seen as evincing proof of the Bible's authenticity. With deep involvement with millennialist scenarios, particularly those promoting the doctrine of Jewish restoration, Palestine was also seen as presenting evidences of prophecies in the site of their dramatic fulfillment, even of projects to quote-unquote facilitate prophecy, such as the Adams colony in Jaffa. As Reverend DeWitt Talmage put it, God with his left hand built Palestine and with his right wrote the scriptures, the two hands of the same being. And in proportion as Palestine is brought under close inspection, the Bible will be found more glorious and more true. All right.
But another one of his obsession with like trying to like prove the Bible like scientifically in like the late 19th century.
Yes, and this, like, again, as we kind of talked about last time, like this idea of like the restoration of the Jews becoming itself like mainstream, and also a certain interpretation of it becoming mainstream, because at one time, like, not only was this not necessarily a mainstream idea, but it also like had many different like permutations about like how exactly, because obviously, like, if you think about it for 1 second, the correspondence between like what the Bible says and if it can even be made at all, but the correspondence between that and like the contemporary state of Israel is incredibly tenuous.
Yeah.
Like,
yeah.
But, or even the Zionist project at all. Yeah. Like,
I think even if you like incorporate like Talmudic and like rabbinical teachings, beyond like the Torah and the Old Testament, I mean, there's explanations for why like the Jews were exiled out of their homeland. And then there's like kind of far off prophecies about like when Mashiach comes back, then like the temple will be rebuilt, but that's kind of like an end times thing. So like It's, you know what I mean? Like the whole thing is not, it's not like I hear so many people say today, it's like, well, for 2,000 years, all Jews across the world were always thinking about Palestine and going back to Israel. They just didn't have the chance yet, you know? Now like they're finally ready, but it's like, nah, not really. Like, yes, that's like the ancestral historic like homeland and everything, but like 2,000 years is a long time, even 1,000
like,
years.
Yeah, not to say it doesn't have any spiritual importance, but it's kind of like saying like all Catholics just want to live in the Vatican. Like, you know, they all just want to go there and live there. Like it's their dream. Or like all Muslims just want to live in Mecca. Like that's, you know, like that's where they want to live.
Yeah, this hyper association with like the land being like the critical thing. While of course in the scriptures, like there's these stories about, you know, Moses and the Canaanites and, you know, the kingdom of Israel and the Babylonian exile and all this stuff. It wasn't taken in the way that it is like interpreted nowadays, like almost universally. Everybody sympathetic to Zionism is like, oh, this is meant almost like this is the core of the religion, when it very much was not the core of, I would say, particularly like European Judaism in this time.
In fact, like the main line, like Herzl had to contend with like the much more popular idea of like trying to assimilate. Like trying to become like part of whatever society you like lived in, rather than like this idea of Zionism as we know it now. Like, yeah, it certainly wasn't like, and now like, yeah, it's very, very core to like American Judaism, you know, for sure. And I imagine European Judaism as well. Like it's like heavily emphasized, like devotion to Israel. I would say, arguably, you know, like I don't like even though like my mom is Jewish and like you know, but I wasn't like really raised with like too much contact with Jewish institutions, but I would venture, based on what experience I do have, that like Israel is more important than God in like American Judaism, you know, institutionally speaking, and like overall, you know, not to say there aren't like a lot of devoted religious Jews. Yeah,
that feels anecdotally true from like people I've talked to who are raised to be like supportive of Israel, but also are like secular Reform Jews. Like, if you have that combination, then like Israel is, you know, it's like here and now.
Like all the schools and stuff always have like IDF soldiers come and like tell them about how important it is. Like it's like really, really deeply like embedded. But that definitely has not always been the case. Like definitely not.
Yeah, I mean, the whole phenomenon like secular Zionism or like political Zionism. Also, like there's people that take it, you know, Zionism is like a purely kind of like religious idea, and then the Herzl's like, I guess, innovation was converting it into something that secular people could support as well. That was like it used religion for its justification, but it also was like very accommodating to very secular people, sort of within the broader group. And that's why I think you can see that today, where it's not necessarily like somebody could be very, very Zionist, and it doesn't necessarily mean that they're high key religious. Like, you know, they go to temple every week and observe. Like they could be sort of a, you know, like the way we have holiday Catholics, like, you know, they do, you know, Rosh Hashanah, et cetera, but like do the Seder. But other than that, like not that religious. But like the political Zionist project is like, you know, they have a religious level devotion to it, which took a lot of time to like massage that into being the hegemonic position. And in this era, I guess what's interesting about the Americans kind of interfacing with it in the 1800s is because it's still, you see how much of not a settled question that is. And in fact, a lot of people are just reflexively like, no, that's like a stupid idea. Like, no, like that, that would never work. Like, why? And oftentimes I think you see like a lot of times with kind of like anti-Semitic reason, just like knee-jerk anti-Semitic reasons, kind of not being sympathetic to it, but also, you know, sometimes just more practical kind of things of like, what?
Like this book by Stephanie Stidham Rogers that I mentioned, Inventing the Holy Land. I didn't love this book because I felt like there were a lot of like sort of, as I said, like certain things taken for granted, like the incredible immediate success of Herzl, because like I guess all Jews had just like never thought of the idea of like, you know, creating Israel before, and once they heard it from Theodor Herzl, they all jumped on board. Like things things like that, saying that like Palestine was badly governed for centuries and so it was barren, like, myths like that. But it does document a lot of like really like creepy and weird like statements from 19th century Protestants visiting Palestine or reflecting on Palestine. One of the big like notions that I feel like she draws attention to that is important is the idea that Palestine was cursed by God, which was huge. Mark Twain mentions it, like everyone was constantly because the Jews killed Jesus and their conception, right? So, like for instance, traveling in the 1880s, Matilda Serrao reflected upon what happened to Palestine because the Jews rejected Christ and Jesus cursed various towns and their inhabitants. Palestine was the home of all that rejected Jesus. The high city, Jerusalem, perched above ravines and lying among the debris of the centuries, might, it seem, be the abode not of men and women and children, but the dwelling place of ruthless emotions such as pride and arrogance and hate. As I sat down for a long while looking down on Jerusalem, I thought to myself, that is undoubtedly the place that crucified Jesus Christ. Like an echo to my thought came a terrible reply, and it would probably do so again.
Oh my God. Wow.
So, yeah.
Wow.
Philip Schaff said that Jerusalem was the most holy and the most unholy place on earth.
It's interesting, this like very S.J. Pilled article, is talking about the universal disappointment that most travel writers, American travel writers had when they traveled to the Holy Land, sort of like what you read with Twain there, where the Palestine, the Holy Land of their Christian imagination never lives up to like what they find there, and they end up having like kind of like a hostile reaction to it. Let's see.
I remember hearing a story of like a woman who like went to go visit Egypt and was like when she got there, she was like, why is everyone wearing nightgowns? Because she was expecting to see like ancient Egypt, like all these like people dressed like in the hieroglyphs and stuff like that, and the paintings on the ancient Egyptian monuments and stuff, like but they were all wearing like thobes.
Mark Twain said, in order to profit by this tour, Twain decides he must unlearn a great many things I have somehow absorbed concerning Palestine, and he devises what he calls, quote, a system of reduction, bringing Palestine within an American context. Quote, the state of Missouri could be split into 3 Palestines, and there would then be enough material left for part of another, possibly a whole one. The Galilee, a, quote, solemn, sailless, tintless lake, looking just as expressionless and unpoetical, when we leave its sublime history out of the question, as any metropolitan reservoir in Christendom, is a disappointment and cannot stand up against Lake Tahoe. The Galilee can, quote, no more be compared to Tahoe than a meridian of longitude is to a rainbow. Jeez, it's really harsh. I mean, I get spoiled Californian, I guess. Lake Tahoe is very pretty. But it's just, it's a quarter of a Missouri. It's so small, that's... Yeah, that's... especially from Americans, like that, I think the smallness does trip out people even today if they go to Israel, like how tiny it is.
Yeah.
Like, you could probably drive from the Gaza area up, like, to... I mean, you could drive up and down the country in like a few hours, I think.
Yeah, and I think that part where he talks about the Galilee is when he really has probably the most like anti-Semitic part of his discussion. I'm trying to say I'm searching for it by hats. So he's talking about Tiberias, which, as we talked about, was like the main Jewish settlement. And it's interesting that he perceives, like he says that Tiberias is the holiest city of Judaism. Like he says that Tiberias is to Jews what Jerusalem is to Christians, which is very interesting. He says the Sanhedrin met here last. For 300 years, Tiberias was the metropolis of the Jews in Palestine. It is one of the 4 holy cities of the Israelites, and it is to them what Mecca is to the Mohammedan and Jerusalem to the Christian. That's what he said.
I'm pretty sure Jerusalem
he's definitely holy, right? Wrong. Yes, but it's weird that he said that.
It's their Mecca.
Yeah, he said that it's their Mecca. But so he was very negative about the Jews that he encountered there. He says, we are camped in this place now, just within the city walls of Tiberias. We went into the town before nightfall and looked at its people. We cared nothing about its houses. Its people are best examined at a distance. They are particularly uncomely Jews, Arabs, and Negroes. Squalor and poverty are the pride of Tiberias.
Okay.
Yeah, he says, they say that the long-nosed, lanky, dyspeptic-looking body snatchers with the indescribable hats on and a long curl dangling down in front of each ear are the old familiar self-righteous Pharisees we read of in scriptures. Verily they look it. Judging merely by their general style and without other evidence, one might easily suspect that self-righteousness was their specialty.
Yeah, it's just like straight out of the Bible, like straight out of my Marvel movie.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, and that is not like the limit
the worst
of
it.
Yeah, no, it is
well,
not.
I found a pretty bad one here.
Okay.
Yeah, since we're on I think Twain, he's ended up on the bad list. I don't think we can save him. So let's see. These conventions, he's talking about, the expectations of expectation, of theatricality, of discrepancy, of disappointment, and even of affirmation of the sacred character of the American landscape, have all been displayed by previous writers, so much so that Twain can parody all of them while incorporating new dimensions. To expectation, discrepancy, and disappointment, Twain adds appropriation and Americanization of Palestinian realities through comic mock violence. Quote, "We are camped near Temnin el Foka," he relates, "a name which the boys have simplified a good deal for the sake of convenience in spelling. They call it Jacksonville." Coming across a group of Arab villagers, he makes the usual comparison of Arabs with Indians, but adding how the villagers, quote, "sat in silence and with tireless patience watched our every motion with that vile, uncomplaining impoliteness which is so truly Indian, and which makes a white man so nervous and uncomfortable and savage that he wants to exterminate the whole tribe."
All right.
Such violence would be dismissed as crude chauvinism, except that the narrator undermines himself continually. His colonial fantasies reveal ironies such as the, quote, "savagery of the white man" and the burlesque cowardice of the narrator. Nonetheless, the effect is to take the Holy Land and figuratively Americanize its geography and population. Okay, so I think he was doing an irony there.
He was just doing a bit.
He was doing a bit, basically, where he's like, I'm an American chud, like, he's sitting there in silence with tireless patience. Which it makes me so nervous and uncomfortable that I want to exterminate his whole tribe. So he's like joking, LOL, like that's what stupid Americans think about, but it's a little
ambiguous. Yeah. It's ambiguous, I think.
It's ambiguous, yeah.
That's the power of irony.
I guess so, right?
Well, was he doing a bit when he wrote this? Because this is one of my my picks from Innocents Abroad.
Okay.
The most famous piece of travel writing in America ever. Palestine sits in sackcloth and ashes. Over it broods the spell of a curse that has withered its fields and fettered its energies. Where Sodom and Gomorrah reared their domes and towers, that solemn sea now floods the plain, in whose bitter waters no living thing exists, over whose waveless surface the blistering air hangs motionless and dead, about whose borders nothing grows but weeds and scattering tufts of cane, and that treacherous fruit that promises refreshment to parching lips, but turns to ashes at the touch. Nazareth is forlorn. About that ford of Jordan where the hosts of Israel entered the promised land with songs of rejoicing, one finds only a squalid camp of fantastic Bedouins of the desert. Jericho the accursed lies a moldering ruin today, even as Joshua's miracle left it more than 3,000 years ago. Bethlehem and Bethany, in their poverty and their humiliation, have nothing about them now to remind one they once knew the high honor of the Savior's presence. The hallowed spot where the shepherds watched their flocks by night and where the angels sang peace on earth, goodwill to man, is untenanted by any living creature and unblessed by any feature that is pleasant to the eye. Definitely not true that there is no one in Bethlehem. Anyway, no living creature. Anyway, renowned
creature.
Renowned Jerusalem itself, the stateliest name in history, has lost all its ancient grandeur and has become a pauper village. The riches of Solomon are no longer there to compel the admiration of visiting Oriental queens. The wonderful temple, which was the pride and glory of Israel, is gone, and the Ottoman crescent is lifted above the spot where, on that most memorable day in the annals of the world, they reared the Holy Cross. The noted Sea of Galilee, where the Roman fleets once rode at anchor and the disciples of the Savior sailed in their ships, was long ago deserted by the devotees of war and commerce, and its borders are a silent wilderness. Capernaum is a shapeless ruin. Magdala is the home of beggared Arabs. Bethsaida and Chorazin have vanished from the earth. And the desert places round about them where thousands of men once listened to the Savior's voice and ate the miraculous bread, sleep in the hush of a solitude that is inhabited only by birds of prey and skulking foxes. Palestine is desolate and unlovely. And why should it be otherwise? Can the curse of the deity beautify a land? Palestine is no more of this workaday world. It is sacred to poetry and tradition. It is dreamland.
It is dreamland. Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah. No. I mean, now I understand like the Mark Twain tendency in like American travel journalism. I think, and like Mark Twain might have been like the first American dirtbag.
Yeah,
in a lot of ways.
He kind of, he does remind me a little bit of like a Vice journalist.
Like a Vice journalist, or like Exiled, or like Hunter.
He's giving
Thompson.
me like Matt Taibbi and Russia vibes a little bit.
Exactly.
Like,
that's what I mean.
It's
like
a
this
bit,
fucking backwards fucking country. It's like piece of shit. Like blah blah blah. But like they're. Like he's coded as being like brilliant and like,
and like subversive somehow, even though it's like literally exactly like 100% supportive of like the worst impulses of empire. Like,
Even Dennis Johnson's writing in Liberia has that big Mark Twain energy, like in that kind of like contempt for like what a shitty place. Like it's like this American attitude of like, you know, but you're kind of like. You're also talking shit about like the colonizers or whoever the Western kind of identify, like Mark Twain's talking shit about the bourgeois people on the tour and how silly and fucking dumb they are and stuff like that. It's like Hunter Thompson like taking acid at the Kentucky Derby, like it's that kind of it is that fucking Vice Taibbi kind of thing that even though nobody credits Mark Twain anymore as being like nobody does a Beatles thing with Mark Twain, but I feel like they should because they all like I don't know if they all secretly read him or it's just seeped into the American mentality that like being an edgy dilettantish traveler, you know, writing these like punchy, irreverent kind of like mean, you know what I mean? Like, I don't know. It's weird.
Like,
it's weird.
Definitely.
Yeah. A lot of shit talking even about the Catholic and Eastern Orthodox shrines, I guess, was popular back then.
Right.
Mark Twain writes of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is Catholic, I believe. When one stands where the Savior was crucified, he finds it all he can do to keep it strictly before his mind that Christ was not crucified in a Catholic church. He must remind himself every now and then that the great event transpired in the open air and not in a gloomy, candle-lighted cell in a little corner of a vase church upstairs, a small cell all bejeweled and bespangled with flashy ornamentation in execrable taste. Like,
nice.
Calm down, man. All right, yeah, he hates it. He hates flashy Catholic shrines. Then, but he also hates tourists, so he's a real tourist, man.
Yeah, exactly. He's a radical tourist. This is an interesting part that or I feel like this is the most one of the most loathsome parts that he has here in Innocents Abroad that makes an interesting connection to the Ottoman context that we were just talking about. He's talking about his trip to Damascus, and he says, then we were called the tomb of Mahomet's children, and at a tomb which reported to be that of St. George who killed the dragon, and so on out to the hollow place under a rock where Paul hid during his flight till his pursuers gave him up, and to the mausoleum of the 5,000 Christians who were massacred in Damascus in 1861 by the Turks. So this is referring to like the Druze-Maronite conflict of 1861, which I think spilled over into Syria, but yeah, we'll maybe talk about that at length in a bit. So they say those narrow streets ran blood for several days, and that men, women, and children were butchered indiscriminately and left to rot by hundreds all through the Christian quarter. They say further that the stench was dreadful. All the Christians who could get away fled from the city, and the Mohammedans would not defile their hands by burying the infidel dogs. The thirst for blood extended to the high lands of Hermon and anti-Lebanon, and in a short time 25,000 more Christians were massacred and their possessions laid waste. How they hate a Christian in Damascus, and pretty much all over Turkeydom as well. And how they will pay for it when Russia turns her guns upon them again. It is soothing to the heart to abuse England and France for interposing to save the Ottoman Empire from the destruction it has so richly deserved for 1,000 years. It hurts my vanity to see these pagans refuse to eat of food that has been cooked for us, or to eat from a dish we have eaten from, or to drink from a goat skin which we have polluted with our Christian lips, except by filtering the water through a rag which they put over the mouth of it, or through a sponge. I have never disliked it. I apologize, but,
wow,
it's the quotation.
Filthy. Wow.
Yeah, this is a quotation, so I apologize, but I have never disliked a Chinaman as I do these degraded Turks and Arabs. And when Russia is ready to war with them again, I hope England and France will not find it good breeding or good judgment to interfere. So this is kind of part of the reason why, some of this paranoia exists, like, in the Ottoman sphere, because you constantly have people being like, when these fucking Ottoman pieces of shit, like, to step out of line, like, one will crush, like, they're just, like, salivating, so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, this is Mark Twain, like a hip modern, author, like, not even I'm starting to see, like, maybe it's not all a bit. That part doesn't feel like a bit. That feels like an angry Substack post.
Yes, and that is, like, actually, it's interesting because that actually is part of, like, the reason, or that, like, we supposed, again, when we're talking about, like, these events that took place, like, where, like, there were massacres of innocent people, like, it's not an excuse, but it is part of the context for why, like, these things took place or how they unfolded. And there's a good article about this, actually. It comes up in Osama Makdisi's article, Rethinking Ottoman Imperialism, where he's talking about something that I think is a good overview of what we're going to talk about going into, like, the Young Turk Revolution and the sort of lead up to World War I and Ottoman Palestine in that context. He kind of recapitulates what we've been talking about a little bit thus far, but he says, the age of Ottoman modernity was inaugurated in 1839. Mahmud II's concerted efforts had begun with the abolition of the Janissaries in 1826, but quickly spread to sartorial and administrative domains and culminated in an era of wholesale modernization known as Tanzimat. The centerpiece of the Tanzimat reforms was the Gulhan decree issued by Mahmud II's successor, Abdul Majid, in 1839, at a time when the Ottoman Empire lay on the brink of total collapse due to Muhammad Ali's imperial ambitions. Among its provisions was the solemn declaration of the equality of Muslim and non-Muslim subjects before the law, beginning with the Gulhan decree, or maybe Gulhani, I don't actually know, but imperial reformers abandoned the term Reaya in favor of Teba. With, like, the suppression of the Janissaries, the new measures of Tanzimat, which represented a clear break with the past, were couched in a language that suggested a reversion to tradition. However, the Gulhane Proclamation and the 1856 Hati Humayun, which followed the Crimean War, formally committed the empire to a course of modernization under effective Western tutelage. The Tanzimat opened the empire to what anthropologist Johannes Fabian has described as the evolutionary quote-unquote stream of time, an idea of a denial of coevalness that was at the heart of modern European colonialism. Although the discourse of reform in the Ottoman Empire was not itself new, 19th century reform was part of a wider culture of modernity. In this culture, the Ottoman Empire sought to culturally define itself as an equal player, especially after the 1856 Treaty of Paris, which formally inducted the Ottoman Empire as a member of the European state system on a world stage of civilization. It was a world stage dominated and Ottomanized by mischievous but modern European states, and a world stage in which Istanbul was only one of many centers. As part of this project of imperial political and cultural reassertion and redefinition, indeed as part of its own cultural logic that placed it on par with other supposedly civilized states, Ottoman modernization generated its discursive opposite, the pre-modern within the empire, be it in the sands of Arabia or in Sebel-i-Duruz. Places like Sebel-i-Duruz or Jebel-i-Duruz, yeah, obviously it's Jebel. I keep forgetting that in Turkish the C's are G's or J's, but I get it most of the time. Jebel-i-Duruz, the mountain, right? Or what Europeans referred to as Mount Lebanon, became locations of the pre-modern, places of danger and anxiety that threatened to destabilize the course of modernization. Intellectual, architectural, and political and social westernization occurred in Istanbul, creating what Göçek has called a new vision of Ottoman society. Ottoman reformers aspired toward an elusive modernity, which they thought was within their grasp, if only they could deflect external European hostility, which retarded Ottoman advancement while also identifying and eliminating internal pre-modern problems which invited European interference. This Ottoman attempt to modernize the empire was both motivated and plagued by a feeling of constant crisis. The first aspect of this crisis manifested itself in the often desperate efforts of reforming officials to outline the exact parameters of modern Ottoman sovereignty in an age of European hegemony. had to reach the 19th century El Dorado, modernity, without becoming a colony of Europe in a century when European empires came to control more than 85% of the surface of the globe. European powers played an increasingly intrusive role in the internal affairs of the empire by emphasizing their duty to protect the non-Muslim minorities from a putative Islamic and Asiatic despotism. Ottoman officials, while they were acutely aware of their need to modernize along European lines, decried repeated European interference on behalf of non-Muslim minorities as sinister attempts to weaken the empire through sectarian means. In Jebel-i Duruz, because of Eastern question politics, which were centered on the expulsion of the Egyptian troops from Syria following the renewed Egyptian-Ottoman hostilities in 1839, and because of episodes of intercommunal violence in the 2 decades that followed the inauguration of the Tanzimat, the crisis of representation expressed itself in dramatic form. For one thing, European intervention was continuous in the region, and European influence was expressed in military terms, through the British defeat of Muhammad Ali in 1840, in cultural terms, with the introduction of Jesuit and Protestant missionary education and medicine, and in economic terms, with the imposition of the free trade treaties of 1838. For another, local notables and commoners in Jebel-i Duruz and the surrounding region seized the initiative between 1840 and 1860 in interpreting the Tanzimat, and did so with the knowledge that European powers played a vital role in their own political, material, and cultural future. Some, such as members of the Maronite church establishment, advocated a Maronite-dominated Lebanon in accordance with the Tanzimat stipulation to protect non-Muslim subjects. Some, such as secular notables from the Maronite Khazin and Druze Janbulat families, insisted that the Tanzimat, because it was premised on an idea of restoring a glorious past, legitimized a full restoration of the old regime's social order. And some, such as the Maronite muleteer Tanyus Shahin, who led a popular uprising against Khazin domination in 1859 in the predominantly Maronite district of Kisrawan, understood the Tanzimat to mean social as well as religious equality, and therefore contended that the Tanzimat legitimized social revolution. He and his followers demanded what they saw as their right to representation and equality guaranteed to them by the imperial reform edicts because they were Christian subjects. A second aspect of this crisis lay in the redefinition of the relationship between rulers and subjects in a modernizing empire. The traditional imperial attitude, which had presupposed an inviolable Ottoman domain of obedience, could no longer be maintained. The temporality of traditional politics, which had reflected a shared understanding between rulers and ruled of the functioning of politics in a heterogeneous empire, and which had in fact regulated an Ottoman accommodation of Druze quote-unquote heretics and Christian quote-unquote infidels, was effectively broken by the urgency of Ottoman modernization. In their race against destruction by advanced Europeans, Ottoman reformers sought to locate and extinguish what they considered to be the pre-modern within their empire. Politics was no longer simply about bargaining with subjects, as Karen Barkey has described the relationship between the Ottoman state and the Jalalis in the early modern Anatolian provinces of the empire, as much as it was of bargaining and performing with Europeans on the world stage of modernization. So this is where he gets into what Mark Twain was referring to. Okay. This feeling of crisis was dramatically illustrated by the transformation of the hitherto marginal region of Jebel-i Duruz into a problem of central importance. It was precisely the fact of a rural, neglected, and relatively unknown region that caused the Ottomans anxiety, for the questions that confronted them were how to incorporate Jebel-i Duruz into a project of Ottoman modernization, and more specifically how to address, mitigate, and ultimately resolve Jebel-i Duruz's pre-modernity within the context of a modern politics with and against Europe. The dispatches and reports of Ottoman officials in the 2 decades following the Tanzimat indicated that they had no clear answer to these questions. For the first time, in fact, Ottoman governors described the region as Mount Lebanon, or Jebel-i Lubnan, conforming to European nomenclature. The term Jebel-i Duruz was abandoned. For the first time, really, Mount Lebanon entered Ottoman imperial consciousness in a sustained manner. Ottoman officials began to discuss what they referred to Jebel-i Lubnan Meselesi, the question of Mount Lebanon, indicating the location of Mount Lebanon within a constellation of other problems that threatened to thwart imperial modernization. Men like Mustafa Pasha, sent in the late 1841 to settle the affairs of Mount Lebanon following sectarian clashes that had earlier erupted in the village of Deir el-Kamar, epitomized the Ottoman predicament. His mission began by a reassertion of social order. He summoned both Druze and Maronite elites to Beirut and relieved Bashar Qasim, who had succeeded the famous Bashir Shihab in 1840, of his powers. He informed the notables that the return of the Shihab dynasty was out of the question. Beyond reasserting Ottoman authority in the name of the reforming sultan, Mustafa Pasha symbolically and physically broke with the old regime by finally abolishing the Shihab dynasty, which had ruled since 1697. Yet this rupture was not complete, for although the Tanzimat was concerned with building a modern nation, there was very little in the dispatches that indicated how this was to be accomplished. Precisely because the Tanzimat lent itself to a variety of interpretations, including a European one that mandated interference, the Ottomans considered the reorganization of local administration imperative to stifling European involvement. The Tanzimat placed the Ottomans in a quandary, for while they repeatedly pledged to obey the Sultan's will to reform, they viewed the natives as essentially unreformable subjects. Ottoman officials were certain, however, that reform and state violence went hand in hand. Public order and security could be guaranteed only by bringing local notables to heel and by removing their stupid, silly, and fickle followers from the realm of politics. The longer Mustafa Pasha remained in Mount Lebanon, the more insistent he became on the urgent need of the central government to act decisively to restore order. Christian notables seemed on the verge of joining the 1842 Druze rebellion against Omar Pasha's heavy-handed policies. The dispatches of Asad Pasha, governor of Saida, further reflected the weakness of the Ottoman local government, whose troops were unreliable and unpaid, which had to borrow coal from the English consulate, which in turn made it quite clear that it would supply no more, and which had a difficult time in suppressing a Druze revolt against Umar Pasha, an Ottoman officer of Croatian origin who had been appointed to directly rule Mount Lebanon in 1842. Like Mustafa Pasha, Assad stretched the age-old conflict between barbaric people, they being in essence too coarse and savage sects, who often need punishment to keep them in order. Ottoman concern reached a climax when Shahin's calls for Christian social liberation spread to Druze-dominated regions of Mount Lebanon, and helped spark sectarian clashes between the Druze and Maronite communities, which in turn led to the infamous War of 1860, in which thousands of Christians were massacred by the Druze in June. It was interesting to me, actually, reading Mark Twain and also looking up how this was covered in the American press at the time, because it was curious to me that they understood the Druze were Muslims.
Yeah, exactly. Like these crazy Muslims, but they're not.
He does say no, they're not. They don't. But I guess it's. Yeah, I mean, Druze sometimes, I don't know, like maybe there is definitely some like taqiyya in the proper sense that maybe is deployed by Druze at various times in history. And also like they can sometimes be kind of like secretive about their like religious identity, I feel, or
they're
protective.
esoteric.
So maybe
they're like officially esoteric. Like their religious practices are secret.
I think that they like
being Druze.
No,
apparently.
I think that they actually kind of developed from like Ismailism. I think that they have like an Ismaili history, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah. But so in July, to add to Ottoman embarrassment, a riot by Damascene Muslims killed several thousand Christians. So,
okay. So there was
here. Yeah, the reasons for the Damascus massacre, as well as the Lebanese war were complex, but most historians agree that an economic recession among traditional artisanal sectors precipitated by European textile imports played a significant role in fueling Muslim resentment against wealthy Christians who dominated trade with Europe. So, So
a little European disruption happening.
Yeah, and it was much more than that in terms of like the constitution of Lebanon, or the government of Lebanon, right? He says, what interests us here are not the details of these sectarian episodes, but how Ottoman reformers took advantage of the restoration of order in Mount Lebanon and Damascus to construct their vision of an Ottoman modernity in contrast to an alleged local pre-modernity. The foreign minister of the Ottoman Empire, Fuad Pasha, who himself was educated in reform schools, was fluent in French, and had served as an Ottoman ambassador to Russia, and was a statesman who embodied many of the ideals of the Tanzimat, went personally to Syria to ensure that modern Ottoman law and order was properly imposed. His immediate objective, however, was to stem European influence, for in the aftermath of the massacres, the French had sent an army to Syria to quote-unquote aid the Ottomans reestablish peace. From the outset of his mission, before he had actually completed any investigations, Fuad Pasha alleged that the violence in Mount Lebanon was a reflection of a, quote, age-old tribal struggle, whereas the outburst in Damascus was the work of unthinking and ignorant Muslims. In report after report, Fuad Pasha contrasted the punishment inflicted by his modern army, whose outfits and organization reflected the new face of the empire, with the supposed tribal savagery of local inhabitants. Tanyush Shahin was condemned as a brigand, and the Kisrawan revolt was suppressed. In Damascus, because of the scale of violence and because of the city's symbolic importance to an Ottoman reconception of their Islamic heritage, scores of quote-unquote ignorant, or jahil, I imagine is what the term is, Muslims who allegedly took part in the riots were arrested. They were executed after hasty trials because they had violated the precepts of the Sharia and the will of the Sultan, both of which Fuad Pasha maintained upheld the equality of Muslims and non-Muslim subjects. He concluded that Ottoman culpability was limited to a neglect of duty at the local level, which resulted in a stain on the honor of a modernizing state. The point here is to understand the implications of Fuad Pasha's convictions rather than their veracity. The descriptions of the conflicts as age-old in the case of Mount Lebanon, or the work of ignorant rioters in the case of Damascus, conveniently located sectarianism in a pre-modern world dominated by fanaticism, ignorance, and tribalism. The Ottoman punishment, following supposedly impartial investigations and sentences in accordance with reformed and allegedly unambiguous penal codes carried out by a Tanzimat army in the presence of European representatives, was by contrast understood by Fuad Pasha to be modern. Modernity, in other words, was the contest between reforming Ottomans and Europeans. Fuad Pasha was out to prove that the Ottoman Empire was just and tolerant and therefore could be modern. The local setting, be it the city of Damascus or Mount Lebanon, provided the stage upon which two interrelated spectacles could be simultaneously enacted. The first was a modern one which pitted Fuad Pasha and his reforming cohorts against their European rivals. It was a struggle in which a reformed army and officials valiantly tried to snatch the initiative from, and thereby defeat, the hubris of European Orientalism, represented by the French army and expressed in the reports of the various European commissioners. This struggle over modernity constituted and defined the second spectacle in which the Ottoman modern crushed the supposed local pre-modern. That is to say, the spectacle of discipline and punishment that went on through 1861. For Fuad Pasha, the local inhabitants themselves were not modern. They did not make or move history as much as they were pawns or objects of a modern historical struggle that pitted, in Fuad Pasha's view, powerful yet scheming Europeans against beleaguered Ottoman reformers. Another implication was the nature of this modern stage and its impact on the traditional relationship between rulers and ruled in the Ottoman Empire. Although Fuad Pasha deployed the language of the old regime in his reports, such as brigandage and the Sharia, he was acutely aware of the world stage on which local order had to be restored. Because the sublime state never accepts that the slightest harm or aggression should befall any of the classes of imperial subjects who take shelter under its protection, decreed Fuad, and because the events that transpired were contrary to the principle of civilization current in the world and beyond the pale in every manner, the sublime state, in accordance with its duty to ensure justice, has decided to punish those involved in the events. The ideology of progress allowed Fuad Pasha to deploy the language of brigandage in the Sharia, thereby tapping into classical Ottoman ruling discourses, to equate the modern Ottoman subject with the tolerant, obedient, and quietist subject. Fuad Pasha reminded his soldiers that although they were in Syria to bring peace and security to this area and punish the sins of the Ottoman subjects because of their cruel acts, they were also there to show everybody what the worth and value of a soldier is and let all our compatriots know our Padishah's justice. On one hand, therefore, the soldiers acted on behalf of their theoretical compatriots in Damascus and Mount Lebanon who lived, at least in the case of Mount Lebanon, in quote-unquote a savage tribal landscape. The imperial soldiers constituted the vanguard of Ottoman modernity, rationality, and nationalism. They were to lead by example, for in addition to being commanded to obey the person of the Sultan, the soldiers and their Ottoman compatriots were exhorted to be loyal to an abstract Ottoman nation. They were meant to embody a concept of national allegiance, which, like loyalty to the House of Osman of the old regime, flowed up the social order from periphery to center. Fuad Pasha envisioned an Ottoman modernity, which included a modern subjecthood composed of fellow citizens or vatandaşlar, who listened, followed, and obeyed rather than actively participated in the governance of the empire. Ottoman modernity introduced a linear progressive understanding of time, which created a temporal distance, a gap that separated modern Istanbul from tribal Mount Lebanon within a refined imperial framework. The closure of this gap became the ostensible goal of Ottoman reform. The inhabitants of Mount Lebanon were not simply savage, for that was a fairly standard Ottoman description of rural mountainous areas even before the Tanzimat, but savage in the context of a race of progress against civilized Europe. Fuad Pasha believed that Lebanese savagery and tribalism held back Ottoman reformers in their quest for the holy grail of modernity. In other words, the Ottoman Empire was waging a war of modernization on two fronts. It was desperately trying to close the metaphorical gap between itself and the European states which continued to intervene in the affairs of the empire, while it also imagined an ever-widening gap that separated its center from its periphery. The closer the Ottoman reformers edged toward modern Europe, the more they drew back aghast at the horror of what they perceived to be their pre-modern subjects. Their own sense of modernity depended not only on their reforms and their emulation of Europe, but also on an increasingly clear representation of their subjects' backwardness and stagnation. One more important point here, he talks a little bit about, their antiquarian adventures, kind of like, their sort of a civilizing mission or the Ottoman man's burden that they kind of constructed for themselves. kind of casting themselves in a European mold. But a key point I think that he mentions toward the end here, I thought it was in this article, maybe I was thinking of a different one where he, as I mentioned before, that like the whole sort of scheme for the sort of Druze and Maronite rule of Lebanon. Oh, I guess it's here. Okay, here we go. So this is talking about Hamdi Bey writing about the costumes of people in the Ottoman Empire. Hamdi Bey made it abundantly clear that his ethnographic survey, just like his later archaeological expeditions, both proved and justified an Ottoman mission to civilize quaint but backwards and often savage peripheries. For example, Hamdi Bey prefaced his discussion of what he understood to be native dress in Syria, stating, "Great historical memories are in abundance in these rich countries, conquered in turn by the Phoenicians, the Hebrews, the Greeks, and the Romans, where the Quran and the Bible, two books of peace, fraternity, and tolerance, have long served as a pretext for crusaders coming from all over the Occident and for Arabs who founded Islam to tear each other apart. This continued up until the Ottoman conquest contained by force these fanatical hatreds, which on occasion would reawaken." Hamdi Bey not only sought to rewrite the history of the Ottoman conquest of the Arab provinces in a profoundly 19th century discourse of tolerance, but he seized on the supposedly timeless costume to underscore other allegedly timeless characteristics of various groups in the Ottoman domains. He sought to adduce what he considered to be the essential characteristics of the native inhabitants of these provinces who were tamed, disciplined, and civilized. That is to say, forcibly removed from their endlessly repeated history of putatively endemic and age-old tribal violence by the Ottoman imperial center. He described the Muslim of Lebanon, by which he meant a Sunni, as imbued with soft and tranquil manners and customs, unlike his turbulent neighbors, the Druze and Maronites. The Maronites, he declared, were remarkably intelligent and proud, and were industrious and rich, but just like their Druze neighbors, with whom they have never been able to live in harmony, the Maronites have proved difficult to subdue. Only since a few years ago has the joint efforts of the Imperial Ottoman government, together with its faithful allies, succeeded in pacifying Mount Lebanon. It should be noted that like Europeans basically came up with this Maronite Druze like dyad rule. It was like a proposal by Europeans accepted, but because obviously the Maronites were patronized by the French and everything, but naturally, today the age-old hatreds of the Druzes and Maronites seem to have been finally quelled. Obedient subjects, they now live as brothers under the legitimate authority of a Christian pasha sent by Istanbul to govern Mount Lebanon. And this is, I think, something that is definitely going to become relevant with the Young Turk revolution and the sort of lead up to World War I and what happens in World War I as well. Although Hamdi Bey's main goal was to portray an Ottoman cultural heritage that he feared might be lost, his supposedly objective delineation of the popular costumes of the different groups of the Ottoman Empire, supplemented with innumerable photographs, reinforced once more the notion that Ottoman modernization was not about equality between center and periphery, but was a project of imperial benevolence and, above all, power that sought to mitigate an alleged civilizational gap between the modernizers of the imperial center and their subjects in the far-flung peripheries of the empire. As the Hamidian state continued to battle Western imperialism, and as the Balkan provinces continued to be whittled away in the 19th century, the civilizing Ottoman gaze over a number of different groups and classes, Anatolian, Kurd, Armenian, Serb, Damascene Muslim, Arab, Maronite, Druze, Jew, Sheikh, merchant, peasant, and urban elite, was increasingly complicated, indeed redefined, as a desire of the modernizing quote-unquote Turkish nation to aid and civilize a backwards quote-unquote Arab nation, as well as the Armenians and Kurds. With the rise of the Committee of Union and Progress, the CUP, came an increasingly explicit racial articulation of modernization that pitted the Turkish race as the most natural and able leaders of the modern empire. Race thinking in the late Ottoman Empire was not, of course, the preserve of the imperial center. However, it is important to note that as Ottoman modernization diminished quote-unquote traditional religious differences that had legitimated Ottoman rule in its classical age, it also introduced a discourse of rational and supposedly scientific race thinking to justify the domination of the largely Turkish-speaking Ottoman center over the Arabic-speaking peripheries of the empire in its modern age. It is not surprising then that the memoirs of Halidi Edib, a woman who was at the forefront of an Ottoman Turkish civilizing mission to educate the women of the Arab provinces during the First World War, reveal a very clear notion of the responsibilities incumbent upon the advanced Turkish nation. Edib claimed that the Ottoman Turks created an Ottoman citizenship. Such an assertion staked out very precisely in previously unthinkable racial terms the notion that Turks, as opposed to Arabs, Kurds, or Armenians, and as opposed to the different classes of Turkish-speaking inhabitants that Hamdi Bey recognized in his costumes populares, created a modern concept of citizenship to which the other subordinate racial and ethnic groups of the empire would have to be gradually and benevolently introduced. Turkey, she wrote, must help the Arabs develop a national spirit and personality, teach them to love their own national culture more than any foreign one, by which she meant French. In Adib's view, the Turk was a natural leader, whereas the Arab naturally corrupt. Echoing Hamdi Bey's view of the indigenous population of the Arab provinces and Fuad Pasha's before him, Adib insisted that the Arab was mired in local passions. When she visited Jerusalem, she noted that there was a hot and unwholesome atmosphere, mixed with religion, passion, verging on hysteria. The Turk alone had a calm, impartial, and quiet look. He stood calmly watching, stopping bloody quarrels and preventing bloody riots in the holy places. Such representations underscore the degree to which Ottoman modernization paradoxically elaborated a language of racial discrimination of a Turkish mission to lead and save the other groups of the empire, at the same time as it constructed a discourse of integrative Ottoman nationalism. Ottoman modernization resisted European imperialism but accepted, with a significant twist, its underlying cultural logic. Just as modern imperialism can be thought of as the European desire to reshape and discipline non-European places and peoples without history, quote-unquote, so too can Ottoman modernization be thought of as an Ottoman desire to try and reshape and discipline the not-yet Ottoman places and peoples. Yeah.
Yeah,
and
that's the dark side of catching up with Europe, is adopting those underlying principles of this racial hierarchy thing. Oh, that could be useful, I guess.
Well, yeah, that's like kind of, yeah, exactly. That's the sort of it's a flip side of the idea of, well, you know, all these European powers are insisting that, like, you know, the religious minorities don't have equality. But, like, if you go and look at these European empires, like, they might have, you know, this sort of Westphalian framework where there isn't, like, you know, formal religious discrimination, or there's, like, a secularity, right? But they certainly have, like, a hierarchy that makes their imperial system possible, right?
It
like,
be
Indians aren't equal with British people. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, like, economically, it's sort of like you need that as a legal justification in order to make the whole enterprise, quote unquote, profitable, or, you know, hyper expropriative, I guess you could say.
Yes.
To extract the requisite amount of wealth. And then so they have all these domains of, like, different ethnic groups, which back when there was more of a religious kind of, like, justification for Ottoman rule, like, it was more religiously organized, right? I mean, that's why you had, like, Muhammad Ali was Albanian, right?
Yeah.
And then this next Pasha was, I presume, was he a Croatian Catholic who was, like, working for the Ottomans?
I don't know who the Pasha of Lebanon that they were referring to was.
He was Croatian, and that he was selected because he was Christian to, like, deal with the Maronites.
I see. Ottoman officer of Croatian origin. Yeah, I remember.
Yeah,
okay.
But then, you know, when they're trying to catch up to Europe and they're looking at Europe's model, even in the late 1800s, like, it's easy to forget how much, like, additional colonial, you know, capture was going on. Like the Berlin Conference was what, like 1888, you know, like Germany started to get into the colonial game properly, like, relatively late, and they were trying to catch up to, like, England and France, and then the Ottomans were looking at their own domain, which is, like, still fairly vast, but
yeah,
you know, now it perhaps was more convenient to sort of, center the Turkish ethnic identity over the subjects in the periphery and say, well, like, we need to do, like, an Ottoman man's burden to kind of, I guess, try to like psyop everybody that, like, we are actually, like, the modernizers, like, we're the calm, rational, you know, advanced civilization that can keep all the kids from fighting with each other, and have this very paternalistic, like, oversight over everything, which I guess ultimately didn't really pan out and save them as an empire. But
yeah, this is, like, part of, like, what, and it actually, like, definitely, I think, was a factor in things like the Armenian genocide, and also, like, other atrocities that happened, like, amidst, like, World War I and that later, or, you know, early period of the 20th century, but later period from what we're talking about now. That's kind of, like, the flip side, as I was saying, of this whole thing of, like, equality, which is, like, you know, a good principle, and was like inspiring to a lot of people like who live in the Ottoman Empire, right? Which I think is worth talking about, touching on what we were kind of talking about when we started recording, the potential of like a like Jewish identity like within the Ottoman Empire that had like a lot of traction at the time in opposition to Zionism like in Palestine. But that ended up also giving rise to this racial thinking as well, and having a lot of like unconsidered potentialities, right? Like it's obviously like the sort of inclusion of, you know, non-Muslims or everybody, you know, the idea of citizenship, right? Changing this from being subjects to like you know, having citizenship in the quote unquote modern mold, right? Like that seems like, you know, a reasonable principle, right? You know, egalitarian. Sure. But the way that it practically panned out, it didn't like ensure equality, right? A lot of people felt, even minorities who did have like Western support or substantial Western support in the Ottoman Empire, like felt that they, you know, it wasn't fully realized in the way that they hoped. You know, some of them with good reason, especially later on. But
the Armenians for sure.
Yeah, the Armenians definitely for sure. Yeah, but also like the you know, as we talked about last time, like the majority in places like Palestine, the Arab majority, or often like, you know, as kind of was hinted at in that article, like they were very much like thrown under the bus because they were like the ones holding back the Turks, right? And everyone just wanted them to get pushed aside, basically.
Yeah, the first of many unfortunate positions native inhabitants of Palestine would be sort of put in like between a geopolitical rock and a hard place, and like viewed by other powerful people in the region as like an obstacle of some kind, you know. And I think that continues to this day, unfortunately. But well, it might be good to talk about the years leading up to the Young Turk Revolution, but you know, before we leave Mark Twain completely.
Oh yeah, okay.
The end of this essay is like an absolute banger, and I mean it sort of has this is a little more of a vibes based tangent, but I think it's very interesting talking about, you know, the crafting of like, you know, American consciousness towards the region, and also the perfidious weaponization of irony. So. And this is an event, I guess, that became relatively famous, where on this trip to the Holy Land, you know, that he describes in his book, he visits the purported grave of Adam. And so they write that Twain deepens this secular designation when he comes to the tomb of Adam to offer the comic epiphany of his tour to the shrine. Adam's grave, located conveniently alongside the tomb of the second Adam in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, would present itself as the height of inauthentic, quote, pious frauds to the skeptical Protestant, making the site perfect for discursive transformation. The tomb of Adam, Twain exclaims, and this excerpt needs to be performed with the exaggerated bombastic style of 19th century speechifying, so I'll try. How touching it was, here in a land of strangers, far away from home and friends and all who cared for me, thus to discover the grave of a blood relation. True, a distant one, but still a relation. The unerring instinct of nature thrilled its recognition. The fountain of my filial affection was stirred to its profoundest depths, and I gave way to tumultuous emotion. The mock lament careens from one parodic or burlesque performance to another. Self-pity, sentimentality, bromide, quote, funerary flapdoodle, hitting upon a series of major chords of oratorical bombast of the time, its effect readily going beyond mere Protestant scoffing at Catholic and Orthodox impostures. One critic a few years later hailed the passage as the height of, quote, serio-comic weeping and wailing, and as an example of the humorous sublime. And the eulogy over Adam's grave became one of the most celebrated passages in the book. Laughter could mock American sentimentality, the type of sentimentality that pervaded Holy Land books, including William C. Prime's Tent Life in the Holy Land, which Twain specifically parodied. But, as the critic Louis Budd rightly points out, the passage's meaning, quote, lay in the daring burlesque of reverence itself, the satire of sanctity itself. First Dirtbag. The passage was so popular that years later, in 1902, a St. Louis newspaper could jokingly query, who was Mark Twain, and answer, the man who visited Adam's tomb, the man who wept over the remains of his first parent, That beautiful act of filial devotion is known in every part of the globe, read by every traveler, translated into every language. Even the dusky savages of the most barbaric corners of the earth have heard of Mark Twain shedding tears at the tomb of Adam. By this time, the ancient monument is fairly mildewed with the grief of Mark Twain's imitators. Indeed, President Grant, upon visiting the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, participated in what had become a peculiarly American tourist practice. Grant was, at least in part, visiting the tomb of Adam because it was the place where Mark Twain wept. Twain enforced the historicizing secularist process, inscribing himself upon the shrine, and therefore transforming the sacred site into a modern tourist attraction. Through comic appropriation, values and identities, once exploded, can become cleared fields ready to be, quote, settled or occupied by new meanings. Once the numinous quality of religious sites, like the numinous quality of Da Vinci's Last Supper, is punctured, the application of invented use values and exchange values begins to alter the uniquely holy into the profanely exchangeable. Religious values inherent in a place or a building, suspiciously akin to a too Catholic sensibility of incarnation, are now able to be detached or moved or replicated or regarded as separate from the embodiment of its meaning, while this dynamic, the comic disruption of all authority, becomes an important part of Twain's later writing, perhaps most evinced in Huck Finn's declaration, "All right, I'll go to hell." See, like, I'm a sicko. Rather than turn in the escaped slave Jim, well, okay, that's based, but, Twain, well, see, you're not going to go to hell if you die for not turning in an escaped slave. See, that means you're good. You're going to go to heaven. You know what I mean? So Huck Finn is the first, like, dirtbag punk, like, I'm bad, kind of person. Anyways, so Twain has little occasion to repeat it in the Holy Land of the Middle East in other works. However, I actually didn't know about this book. Tom Sawyer Abroad, published in 1894, gave Twain one more opportunity to supplant religious with bourgeois secular values regarding the Holy Land. This potboiler, although not one of Twain's more memorable works, carries Tom Sawyer, Huck Finn, and Jim in a balloon ride across Africa to Egypt.
Oh my
Before
God.
their arrival,
I didn't know about
however,
this either.
I know, right? Like,
Yeah.
this was never made
All
no movie. Before their arrival, however, Tom attempts to recruit Huck and Jim to join a crusade in a characteristic logomachy.
Yeah.
Logomachy?
Yeah, like War of Words. War of
Words, okay. Wow.
Yeah.
A sort of brilliantly absurd Socratic dialogue. Quote, "A crusade is a war to recover the Holy Land from the Paynim," Tom asserts, against the Socratic questions of Huck and Jim. Why, the Holy Land, there ain't but one. Although we know, considering the dual Holy Land sensibility, how ironic that statement is. Eventually, Tom explodes in frustration to counter Huck and Jim's assertions that it would be theft to steal someone's land. Quote, "They own the land, just the mere land, and that's all they do own. But it was our folks, our Jews and Christians, that made it holy, and so they haven't any business to be there defiling it. It's a shame, and we ought not to stand it a minute. We ought to march against them and take it away from them." Tom ultimately quits arguing with people who, quote, "try to reason out a thing that's pure theology by the laws that protect real estate." Oof. Okay. I mean, that's
all right.
Not wrong there. Okay. So what Tom presents is the rationale for the, quote, "peaceful crusade." The particular movement of Europeans, and to a lesser degree Americans, whether or not they were sanctioned by their respective governments, to participate in the Eastern question through fervid Christian intervention and colonization in Palestine. Published at the dawn of Herzlian Zionism, the dialogue could also be seen as critiquing that latest form of, quote, "recovering the land for, quote, our Jews and Christians." Here, the laws that protect real estate are those of bourgeois relations, the same, quote, "laws that have, through irreverence, placed the tomb of Adam in the realm of the tourist site." One of Twain's favorite burlesque techniques was to take a high-minded spiritual value, such as pure theology, and render it in terms of mundane commercial language. But as Tom asserts, and Twain satirizes, religious and national narratives can counter even property rights, just so long as a, quote, "higher right," notably the needs of empire, is asserted. Twain's satire is directed more broadly than only the appropriation of Palestine. Rather, it targets all imperialist rationales, such as those that would soon lead the U.S. to expropriate the Philippines after its war with Spain. In The Innocents Abroad, Twain uses comic subversion to strip religion of its aura in favor of bourgeois tourist values. Decades later in Tom Sawyer Abroad, he employs commonsensical bourgeois property rights to strip away the aura of the natural from the religious rationales of imperial ideology. The secular American encounter with the Holy Land entails other dynamics, blah, blah, blah. But I don't know. I'm reading this, but like I don't know if I agree with the conclusion. It entails other dynamics. And as the 20th century progressed, that would also include humanist secular support for colonization. But in Mark Twain, we see one strand of American cultural tradition, the transformative power of irreverence. See,
the transformative power, yeah.
But I was saying also, like, we see one strand of American cultural dominance, the transformative power of irreverence or something. Because, I mean, they kind of assert in this essay that the bit that he did, like, pretend crying over the tomb of Adam, became, like, this sensation, and it, like, it was, like, a ritual kind of a desecration of this Catholic, like, holy monument, and reduced it to, like, the equivalent of place where you like go to like take TikToks like at, which I guess, you know, you could read as like a critique or whatever, but it's weird that like everybody was like, I guess it's one of those things where like you do a bit and it's got some like serious satirical thing behind it, and then everyone just kind of like accepts it as like, that's funny. Like, and so everyone just wants to go to the tomb of Adam because they're like, haha. I don't know. Or it's the first time that Americans were like, let's go to a sacred religious site and like laugh at it, to be like LOL. Like it's interesting. Then he's like, that's a great thing, and I'm like, well, it's
kind of like let's do like a crusade, like ironically.
Yeah,
like, you know, like wouldn't it be a great bit if we like colonize Palestine? Like we don't actually believe in that stuff, but it's like. Yeah,
that's what I'm seeing reading this Mark Twain. Like I'll give him, I guess, like credit for like I don't know, his intent to like satirize. According to this author, that was their intent. But you know, at the same time, like were they also subconsciously sort of doing the soft power work of like as this person kind of lays out, like. You know, by making something like LOL, like these crazy people think that, you know, Jesus died in like a shrine. Like, I don't know. It just like, this place sucks, you know, then you're kind of laying the groundwork, whether you intend to or not, for deeper penetration. I mean, it's evidenced like, by the fact that like, the president of the United States went there and was like, LOL, like, I'm at the tomb of Adam. Like, take that, Catholics. Like, I don't know, it's like very
exactly, it's
Protestant
like
American vibe.
Yeah, definitely. It's kind of like, I get it, it's kind of like winking a little bit, but it's doing a bit, but it certainly isn't like, I don't think that he's like joking about like any of the things that he says about Arabs or like the people who live there. I don't think that that's a joke. I don't think he's like pretending to be racist.
See, that's the thing where it's like, like it sounds like he's actually in accord
I know that, you know, he wrote like that anti-slavery book, Huck Finn and everything, but I think that is actually racist. Like, I think that he's believes
definitely
that stuff.
Well, he's kind of emblematic of like the late like 19th century kind of like American Yankee kind of guy. You know, always says he's from California, but you know he's from Hartford, Connecticut. So Samuel Clemens, I don't know. But like that kind of thing of like being very kind of proud of yourself for like being in support of abolition and like ending slavery. But then when they turn outward, like after the war, like he says, when all the bourgeois people go traveling, like they have the attitude towards that they have, it seems, towards most of the like non-white cultures they encounter is very similar to that of like the attitude towards the Native Americans, which at that point, that's the other like weird, you know, the duality of like the era of ending slavery is then they immediately moved on to like waging decades of low intensity warfare on like the American plains and in the American West, and basically ethnically cleansed all of it. You know, and like stole all the land. So like that was also, and then so I can see like, I mean, it's like he said, he compared, like I know as a bit, but like he compared the Arabs to like Indians, and like they just sit there like looking at you, you know, it's like making you nervous.
I don't think that was a bit. I don't think that was a bit. Like, I think that, yeah, like, I don't think that the comparison itself was a bit. I think that there's like a little bit, yeah, like there's a little bit of irony like in the attitude, or like a joke in the attitude, and maybe like there's even a little bit of self-parody, or like kind of like, hanging a lampshade on it, as they say. But it's kind of just like, oh yeah, if I'm ironically racist, it's not racist. Like, I don't actually mean it. Which I don't think it's true. I think that he did mean a lot, like most of that stuff. I think that he did actually mean that. Like, I think that that's part of like the thing of like, all these travel books make a big deal out of this like glorious Holy Land, and it's a fucking shithole full of like freaks.
I dropped LSD and the Sea of Galilee, and it sucked. Like, it's something like that.
Exactly.
Yeah,
like,
no, exactly. It's like, but that is, I mean, I guess that is a powerful American discursive technique that
and I mean, I think you do kind of see that attitude like today, where it's like that kind of like above it all thing of like, oh, these like religious freaks like fighting over like this Holy Land, like whatever, like, but I believe in like real politique, and I don't give a fuck, and like I only care about like what the superior race is, or like whatever, like it's just, it's interesting. He mocks like religion, and that comes through very clearly, that like he doesn't take like at least the modes of religiosity that he encounters like in the Ottoman Empire or like the Arab world very seriously. But
he's pretty hostile to all of them.
Like, even though he still does come off as being Christian, but I don't think that, but the race stuff, it's kind of like a similar thing to what we were just talking about, where it's like, okay, yeah, like you're mocking that, but what comes through as like your actual views are that he's almost like making fun of the religious mystique that's around these people, and saying like, oh, you think of these people as being like these religious characters, and like these figures, you have this reverence for these people because of like the Old Testament and stuff like that, but they just suck. Like, they're pieces of shit. Like, they don't have any special quality because they're connected to these places. Like, so it's just kind of like ultimately demeaning and ultimately like dehumanizing. It's not.
He's doing the thing where I feel like maybe he was having a go at a lot of like self-righteous. He definitely was, right? Because he was parroting these other Christian like travel books. He was like making fun of like the sort of evangelical, like sentimental American chuds, like the normies, back home, and desecrating the Holy Land while also being casually racist about all the people who live there.
Yeah,
like, but he's doing that like, I'm an atheist. Like, I'm an atheist, so I'm gonna shit on like every religion, but it's like also kind of like it
but actually I'm a Protestant, and I'm gonna shit on every other religion. I have the same religion as these evangelicals, but I just think that they're snooty about it, or like they're up their own they're too up their own asses about it. And also, like, it's kind of, it's a little bit of the South Park thing of, like, everyone gets it, like, there's no, like, moral, like, dimension to it at all.
But there's still, like, there's, like, an old line Protestant bias
great, like,
in there.
Moralists.
They got off a little easier than everybody, because they're, like, from the author's POV, like, they are what's kind of normal. Like, that's the protagonist default, and everyone else is fucking weird, man. Like, two stupid shrines, like, we should just bomb this place, like, but it also, you know what, it also stands out to me, like, it syncs up so well with like both America's like interactions with this region, but also just like you said, like America's still like kind of developing status in the 19th century of like really like politically in a lot of ways like a nation of like teenagers. That are just like, what? Like, Palestine, this sucks. Like, just like not really appreciating like a lot, like kind of very energetic, but like provincial, and like kind of going out into the world for the first time, but kind of being sheltered, but also being very confident that like they have bright ideas and are like, want to, and just like changing, and like, anything that's old sucks. Like,
exactly,
for the most part. And because back then, I mean, there still were like, monarchies and kingdoms and empires, and like America did, like with very few exceptions, like kind of stand
most
out
of like, the like empire, like most of the world was like empires of like most of the like the nations were monarchies. Like most of them were empires at that time. Like,
so this is truly the age where, a sort of a bourgeois, liberal-minded person could really feel like they were on the revolutionary edge of, like, just whatever.
Yeah, and I think Mark Twain leaned into that, like, identity a lot. Like, I'm an American Yankee in King Arthur's court, like, just me, like a little American Yankee. Like, thumbing my nose at all this pomposity, European pomposity, but also I can't wait until France and Britain destroy the Ottoman Empire, Well,
that's also like geopolitics is like a baseball game or something.
Yeah,
exactly.
It's
sort of like this distant, weird, phenomenon that they don't have a lot of direct experience with, or so it's just like football teams or something going at it. And because there's huge oceans separating you from all these places. So they could blow themselves up and whatever. I'll just go back to California.
Right. I mean, as I've said before, I guess I'm not 100% surprised, but I'm glad that the dirtbag contingent does seem to have a little bit. I mean, it's funny, Matt Taibbi is not really talking about this and still kind of going on about the censorship of the political right. But I think that's still what he's harping on about the Twitter files and shit during this time. But a lot of the sort of dirtbag podcast contingent does have a conscience about the issue of Palestine. Although you do see some, there definitely is the sentiment out there in its sort of unreconstructed form. We mentioned before, expressed by some, who cares? The Jews just gonna kill them. They don't matter. They're just savages. This is not Bronze Age,
Yeah. I mean, that contingent is they've been fighting.
But I feel that's kind
war.
of baked into the attitude in a way too. They allowed that possibility because that is a general attitude towards politics that they often have. I mean,
you want to talk about weaponized, the kind of toxic weaponization of an ironic posture to just be nothing matters. I would have been best friends with Ghislaine Maxwell. Just say disgusting shit and just nothing matters. So then
it's
well, then
LOL, killing Arabs, LOL, shitty Arabic name, LOL, etc.
LOL, I love Kissinger. Just So I think, but
I get it's a bit, but we know how it definitely has an effect. It definitely and the thing is that it's because of the impressionability, unfortunately, of people where they really for whatever reason talk about their religious reverence, they have a certain religious reverence towards or sort of parasocial devotion to certain personalities, and when they model a certain stance towards things, it does have an impact, which is why I do appreciate those who have shown a conscience on the issue of Palestine in particular. But I think that in general, it's a bad that sort of attitude, and and I think it can, when there's an incredible sincerity about certain things, like Bernie, who has really shown himself to be a piece of shit where it matters, when there's all of our energy directed towards our incredible intense investment in the glory of Bernie, and this is our one chance to step through the door of history and achieve glory. That also was bad.
Reckoning with how much of a probably a dead end.
Yeah,
it always was,
or that that kind of thing of the Mizrahi tend to vote for Likud actually, so this decolonization shit won't get you very far. All right, it's kind of that type of thing of sneering, scoffing, bullshit, where it's I don't know. I do, yeah. You definitely think that it's a political attitude that is toxic. I appreciate as far as it goes in terms of having a conscience on the Palestine issue, but you can see where it falls short. It falls short as well. But I'm definitely sussed out by irony, and I definitely think that irony around this topic, especially the ambiguous sort, where it's not clear what the joke is. LOL, I love Kissinger. Is that a joke?
No. I mean,
that's not funny in and of itself.
Even,
that's just saying something that you allegedly don't believe. It's I'm just gonna make a straight up for instance, I'm gonna just say something racist, but LOL, I don't believe it. That's not really funny.
It's a bit like Israel, which I realized the other day is maybe the biggest small bean country in modern history. Mm-hmm. But people like that like to do they like to accuse people of doing the small bean act, but they're kind of small beans themselves of I'm gonna say something.
Israel is very much a small bean country.
I'm gonna do something very inflammatory, murder thousands of children in airstrikes, and then when people get mad about it, be like, what? I'm just a little small bean, you know, watery eye emojis, like, just what? Like, I don't know why people are so mean. Like, I've never seen this amount of hate for like me before, and it's like okay,
or that
you're
also
war crimes, like
that kind of like very loose relationship with like the truth and like having kind of like a for the lulz orientation toward, like, I think that's definitely true, like in the general like sentiment, like or the general sort of a pro-Israel faction online. They have kind of like an lol, like, all right buddy, like sense, like, or like kind of an indignance when they're called out for like saying obvious lies, where it's like they don't like say it was a bit because it actually was like an attempt at propaganda. But there's definitely, I think, there's a certain sympathy in the sort of vibes to me of like how they react when like caught lying, and how people react when like called out on saying something that's like full of shit or like something evil, and then just saying it's a bit. It's like the same type of thing of like, oh yeah, like, so we like, took these dead bodies and like said they were Palestinian, said they were Israelis, but actually they're like a bunch of Palestinians that we killed. Like, lol, who cares? Like, yeah,
LOL,
like, it's just a
like,
bit.
I'm LOL, I'm doing Hasbara, like,
Yeah, or like,
okay.
Oh yeah,
I mean,
I put on like a nun's habit and like pretended to be like a hijabi nurse, like in an Israeli hospital, like begging to be freed from, or sorry, in a Palestinian hospital, like begging to be freed from Hamas. Like
that's right.
Yeah, like, but LOL, like,
that.
I was joking. I definitely see that, a little bit of that. And I've seen people increasingly be like, people say like, oh, you're committing genocide. Just say like, who cares? So
That's a great development. Yeah. I haven't seen as much. Maybe I've just been like staying away from X a little bit more. But yeah, I don't think irony is like getting them through this one. Like, you can only be so ironic about it. And also like their defense is also kind of, they're small beans. So like
the Jews are tired.
Yeah, tired.
Yeah,
like,
tired.
You see that free parking sign.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
I think it
they're
says
tired.
Free Palestine.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Like, oh, like, yeah, sorry, I'm tired. So, like, I made up a bunch of lies. Like, I committed a genocide. Like, but on the other hand, like, I'm tired. Like you people have worms in your brains. Like, you're complaining about me committing a genocide.
Yeah, I mean, I'm seeing a lot of that, like, attacking kind of like the college age, like, protesters, and like kind of going after them on just kind of like,
exactly.
They're like blue-haired Antifa people, like these dumb kids, like they don't know. Like watching, I've been checking in on a Bill Maher's show, and like that has become like just a
that's what I can't deal with. I would rather
pro IDF
for like
zone.
An hour.
That is an IDF safe space, that show now, and but I feel like it transmits like, I guess, what certain people in Hollywood are feeling right now, and it's like it does feel kind of like this alternate universe where like they feel attacked, they feel like threatened, I don't know, by the fact that they're like protests in America. It's like, oh my God, but then they're also fully in support of like what's happening. Like, they're not going to listen. All they're going to do is like attack the reputations of anybody, and definitely call for like all those people that were like anti-cancel culture for the last like 4 years are very pro cancel culture now. Like, it's different
for sure,
this time.
I mean, I think that some people definitely feel that way. Like, I think that, and I almost would put Bill Maher in this latter category, because there definitely are some who like do have that small bean mentality where like it is in some way sincere, and they do feel like that they're under attack or whatever, and like this is like retaliatory. But then I think there are some who like actually just feel like, yeah, like their existence is inconvenient for us, so like we're gonna genocide them, and like, I'll say whatever just to like get that accomplished, or to just like,
you're right. There's
and
almost
I'm righteous, like this is right for me to do. Like, yes, it's a genocide, but it's also okay. And like, if you take issue with it, I'm just gonna like say like whatever. I'm just gonna flip you off. Like, I think that's also an attitude, and I feel like Bill Maher actually falls into that category. Like,
I think so. That's a big one. The kind of like a strength fetish of like, not gonna fucking back down. Like, sick of this bullshit. Like,
right, when he said that no colonization had happened, but also like if only more of the world had been colonized, because it's the like everything good comes from the West or whatever.
Yep. Yeah. Just casually saying that. See, that's the thing. You start going on, and then you have to back it up with even more insane statements, and then it's really gonna mask off.